First thing Mabel Lane heard that evening was not the bell for service, but Lady Redmarsh's voice saying, "If the girl drops so much as a spoon tonight, send her away before His Grace sees her." Mayfair, London, 1849, had gathered itself into one of those glittering spring evenings when every window along Grosvenor Square seemed to hold a candle against the dusk. Inside Redmarsh House, the chandeliers had been lit, the silver had been polished until it reflected faces like water, and the dining table stretched beneath white linen, crystal glasses, and enough roses to disguise the unease beneath the roof. Below stairs, no one spoke above a murmur. Footmen moved with stiff shoulders. The cook snapped at a scullery maid for breathing too loudly near the soup. The butler inspected gloves, as if the fate of England depended upon a thumbprint. And Mabel stood beside the service table in her plain black dress, her white apron freshly pressed, her cap pinned low over hair that Lady Redmarsh had once called too fine for a servant's head. She did not touch the spoon. She did not move at all. Stillness had become one of her few protections. A servant who moved too quickly could be accused of eagerness. A servant who moved too slowly could be accused of insolence. A servant who looked up could be thought impertinent, and a servant who looked down could be thought guilty. Mabel had learned to exist in the narrow inch between offense and obedience. It was a small place to live. She had lived there for 11 years. Mabel. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pike, appeared at her side with a tray of folded napkins. Her voice was not unkind, but it had been polished hard by long service. "You are to carry the second course from the sideboard, no farther than Mr. Alden instructs. Keep behind the chairs. Do not answer unless spoken to. Do not let Miss Fenwick provoke you." Mabel lowered her eyes. "Yes, Mrs. Pike. And for pity's sake, child, do not look as though you are listening." Mabel almost smiled. She was always listening. It was the only education Redmarsh House had not managed to take from her. From open doors and half-closed corridors, she had learned the price of a ruined reputation, the weight of a dowry, the names of families who bowed to one another in public and bled one another dry in private. She knew which ladies wore paste jewels while pretending they were diamonds. She knew which gentlemen arrived with charm and left with debts. She knew that Lord Redmarsh had spent the morning in his study burning papers, and that Lady Redmarsh had dismissed the old linen maid after finding her near the locked east cupboard. Most of all, she knew that tonight mattered because His Grace Gideon Harrowby, Duke of Westmere, had accepted an invitation no one expected him to accept. Dukes did not come to Redmarsh House by accident, not this Duke. His name had travelled below stairs before his carriage ever reached the square. Cold, exacting, rich enough to ignore flattery. Powerful enough to make men regret lies they had told in rooms where they believed no one important was listening. Mabel had never seen him, yet his coming had tightened every voice in the house. Lady Redmarsh had changed the seating plan 3 times. Lord Redmarsh had sworn at his valet. Miss Cressida Fenwick had rejected 2 gowns, before settling upon pale blue silk and pearls arranged to suggest innocence at considerable expense. Mabel knew all this, and yet the Duke was not what made her fingers curl secretly against her apron. Beneath the clean white cotton, sewn into a small inner pocket, with thread she had stolen from the mending basket, lay the miniature portrait. It was no larger than her palm. The gilt frame had worn thin at the edges, and the little painted face beneath the glass had faded with time, yet Mabel could have drawn every line of it in darkness. A woman with calm grey eyes, a delicate mouth that looked as though it had once known laughter, but had chosen silence for the sake of someone beloved. A blue ribbon near one shoulder, 2 faint initials in the corner, E.A. Mabel had no memory of the woman's voice, not truly. Only fragments returned sometimes in dreams, a hand smoothing her hair, a whisper near her ear, the smell of lavender and rain on wool. Never let them take my face from you. She did not know whether the words were memory or longing. She only knew they had carried her through years, when Redmarsh House tried to convince her she had arrived in the world with nothing. No family, no history, no claim upon tenderness. There you are. Miss Cressida Fenwick's voice cut through the servants' passage with soft, practiced cruelty. Mabel lifted her tray and turned. Cressida stood at the threshold in her blue silk, one hand resting against the doorframe, as if she had wandered below stairs by charming mistake. Ladies did not generally enter the service passage before dinner. Miss Fenwick did whatever made other people uncomfortable, then called discomfort proof of their poor breeding. Her fair hair had been arranged in shining coils, and a sapphire comb trembled at the back like a captured butterfly. Her gaze moved over Mabel's cap, collar, apron, and hands. It lingered a moment too long on her face. "Mamma says you are not to serve near the Duke." Mrs. Pike stiffened. "Miss Fenwick, Mr. Alden has arranged the service." Then Mr. Alden may arrange it again. Cressida smiled without warmth. "The Duke is accustomed to better houses. We should not have him distracted by a maid who forgets she is a maid." A footman looked down at the floor. Another pretended to adjust the wine basket. Mabel felt the old heat rise beneath her collar, but she held her face still. Anger was a luxury for people who could afford witnesses. "I won't forget, miss," she said. Cressida's eyes narrowed, perhaps because the answer contained no tremor. "No, I suppose you won't." "Not if you're reminded often enough." She stepped closer, close enough for Mabel to smell orange blossom water and the faint metallic scent of pearl pins warmed by candlelight. "Your cap is crooked." It was not. Mabel knew it was not. She had pinned it twice because Lady Redmarsh noticed such things when she wished to find fault. Still, Cressida lifted one gloved hand as if to touch it. Mabel forced herself not to step back. A retreat would amuse her. Endurance would bore her. But as Cressida's fingers hovered near the edge of the cap, her gaze slipped again to Mabel's apron, to the place where the hidden pocket lay flat against her waist. Something passed through her expression. Not knowledge, suspicion. "You're very careful with that apron," Cressida said softly. Mabel's heartbeat struck once, hard. "It was freshly pressed, miss. How devoted you are to neatness. A servant's neatness reflects upon the house." Cressida laughed under her breath. "Listen to you. One would think someone had taught you phrases from a governess." The word governess landed strangely. It always did. Mabel had no memory of lessons, but books had never looked foreign to her. French words on discarded invitations had once made sense before she had any reason to understand them. At 12, she had corrected a footman's pronunciation of a guest's name and received a slap of warning from Lady Redmarsh for being unnaturally forward. Since then, she had hidden knowledge the way she hid the portrait. Close to the body. Never surrendered. "Miss Fenwick." Mr. Alden, the butler, appeared at the passage door with his chin high and his expression grave. "The first carriage has arrived." Cressida withdrew her hand. Her smile returned, sweet enough for upstairs. "Then do try not to shame us, Mabel." She swept away in a pale shimmer of silk. Only when her footsteps had faded did Mrs. Pike release the breath she had been holding. "Do not answer her again unless you must." "Yes, Mrs. Pike, and keep your hands steady." Mabel looked down. Her hands were steady. That was the trouble. People expected pain to announce itself. They expected shaking fingers, wet eyes, a broken voice. They did not know what to make of a woman who had learned to suffer quietly and still pour wine without spilling a drop. The upper bell rang. The sound traveled through the house like a command from another world. Doors opened. Warmth spilled from the dining room, carrying the rich scents of roasted meat, beeswax, hothouse flowers, and perfume. Mabel took her place behind the second footman and lifted the tray. The portrait pressed lightly against her through the apron, a hidden weight no one else could see. She told herself it was only painted ivory and gilt, only a keepsake, only the last foolish remnant of a mother who might have been no one important at all. Yet tonight, with Lord Redmarsh burning papers and Cressida, watching her apron and a duke arriving like judgment. In a black evening coat, the miniature felt less like a memory than a secret trying to breathe. Mr. Alden opened the dining room door. Conversation rolled outward, bright and brittle. Mabel stepped into candlelight. For a moment, the room blurred into silver glass, flowers, and faces turned toward rank rather than truth. Lord Redmarsh stood near the mantel, smiling too broadly. Lady Redmarsh sat already composed, her diamonds cold at her throat. Cressida glowed beside an empty chair reserved for the guest of honor. Then the final gentleman entered. Tall, dark-haired and unsmiling, Gideon Harrowby, Duke of Westmere, brought with him the peculiar silence of a man no one dared interrupt. He paused just inside the room while Lord Redmarsh bowed. His gaze moved once across the table, past the flowers, past Cressida's practiced brightness, past Lady Redmarsh's diamonds, and came to rest on Mabel. Not on the tray, not on the servant's cap, on her face. Mabel lowered her eyes at once, but not before she saw something change in his expression. It was not admiration. It was not recognition, not yet. It was the sharp stillness of a man who had noticed that one thing in the room did not belong to the story everyone else was telling. Mabel lowered her eyes because a servant who held a duke's gaze could be ruined by less than a word, yet the awareness of him did not leave her. It moved through the dining room like a second candlelight, colder and more exact. She felt it when she stepped behind Lord Redmarsh's chair. She felt it when Mr. Alden signalled for the soup to be served. She felt it when Cressida laughed at something a gentleman said, then glanced across the table to see whether his grace had admired the sound. He had not. Gideon Harrowby sat with the stillness of a man who wasted neither motion nor courtesy. He answered Lord Redmarsh's welcome with perfect civility, accepted wine with a slight inclination of his head, and gave Miss Fenwick no more attention than etiquette required. That alone was enough to sharpen the air. Redmarsh House had dressed itself for conquest. The Duke had arrived, as if he had come to inspect a fault in the walls. Mabel moved behind the chairs with the tray balanced upon her palms. The dining room glittered, but she knew the underlayer of it. The roses had been forced in hothouses. The silver had been borrowed from a cousin who expected repayment in introductions. Lady Redmarsh's diamonds had been reset twice to disguise that several stones were replacements. Everything in the room was arranged to imply permanence. Everything felt breakable. "Your Grace," Lord Redmarsh said, lifting his glass, "we are honoured beyond measure." Westmere has been too long absent from Mayfair tables. "Mayfair has many tables," Gideon replied. "Few absences are noticed for long." A delicate pause followed. One lady smiled because she assumed wit had occurred. Lord Redmarsh smiled because he could not afford not to. Cressida leaned forward, her pearl earrings trembling. "Surely some absences are felt more keenly than others, Your Grace." Gideon looked at her. "By those who keep account of them, perhaps." Mabel, setting down a dish at the sideboard, saw Cressida's fingers tighten around the stem of her glass. It was the smallest thing. Most would have missed it. Mabel did not. She had been trained by fear to notice hands. Lady Redmarsh turned smoothly to the woman beside her and began speaking of the opera, as if the conversation had gone exactly as intended. Mr. Alden signalled again. Mabel lifted the next dish. Roast fowl with herbs, stewed mushrooms, a sauce-boat polished to a mirror shine. She crossed behind Cressida's chair and kept her gaze fixed upon the edge of the table. The miniature pressed against her apron with each breath. She had secured it well. She knew she had. Yet Cressida's earlier glance at that hidden pocket had left a thread of unease beneath her ribs. "Careful, girl," Cressida murmured without turning her head. "We wouldn't want another little accident below stairs." Mabel did not answer. The correct response was silence. The safest response was silence. She set the sauceboat down where Mr. Alden indicated and stepped back. Lord Redmarsh's voice carried from the head of the table. "I understand Westmere has taken renewed interest in old estate matters. A tedious business, I imagine." "Tedious to those who profit from neglect," Gideon said. Mabel's hand tightened around the edge of the empty tray. Lord Redmarsh's smile remained in place, but colour rose along his neck. "A severe view. An accurate one is often mistaken for severity." Another pause. This one was not delicate. It was sharp enough to cut the roast. Mabel felt Lady Redmarsh's gaze flick toward her, as though a maid could somehow be blamed for the Duke's answers. Cressida must have felt the room slipping away from her family's control, because her laughter came a little too brightly. "Mamma, you have not told His Grace about the new Italian glass. Papa brought it home only last week." Lady Redmarsh's eyes cooled. "Later, my dear, but it is so pretty." Cressida lifted the glass before her, tilting it toward the light. "See how thin the stem is? One almost fears to touch it." Her gaze moved to Mabel. "Mabel, come here. His Grace should see it in proper light." Mr. Alden's chin snapped up. Mabel stopped. Servants did not approach guests without need. A lady calling a maid forward at table was not kindness, it was display. Lady Redmarsh said softly, "Cressida." The warning was real, but too late. Every face had turned. Mabel stepped closer because refusal would become insolence before the breath left her mouth. "Yes, miss." Cressida held out the glass with 2 fingers, smiling as if they were engaged in an innocent household matter. "Take it to the candle, will you?" Slowly. "It's very precious." Mabel set down her tray on the sideboard. She took the glass by the lower stem, careful not to touch Cressida's glove. It weighed almost nothing. A thing made to prove refinement by being easy to break. She turned toward the nearest branch of candles. She had taken 1 step when Cressida shifted in her chair. The movement was slight. A silk slipper extended just enough. Mabel saw it. She adjusted not gracefully but quickly, and saved herself from stumbling. What she could not save was the wineglass already standing near Cressida's elbow. Cressida's sleeve brushed it. The glass tipped, struck the table edge, and fell. Red wine spread like a dark bloom across the linen before the crystal shattered on the polished floor. The room went silent. Cressida gasped with perfect timing. "Oh, Mabel." The name sounded like disappointment prepared in advance. Lady Redmarsh closed her eyes for half a second. Lord Redmarsh pushed back from the table. "Clumsy girl." "I did not touch it, my lord," Mabel said, before caution could stop her. The instant the words left her, she knew they had cost her. A servant did not correct the family at dinner. Cressida pressed a hand to her breast. "Don't be frightened. No one is blaming you for being nervous. She should be nervous if she cannot cross 10 feet without destruction," said an older gentleman near the end of the table. Mabel knew him by sight. Sir Percival Dane, a man who spoke to servants as though they were furniture that had briefly misbehaved. These houses grow careless with their hiring. Heat rose to Mabel's face, but she knelt at once. That was what one did when glass broke. One lowered oneself beneath the level of judgment and gathered the pieces before anyone saw blood, stain, or tremor. Mr. Alden moved forward, but Lord Redmarsh lifted a hand. Let her clean what she has done. Gideon's chair did not scrape. He made no dramatic motion. Yet Mabel felt his attention sharpen. She gathered the largest shard in her napkin. The red wine had spread near her knee. A fragment flashed beside the leg of Cressida's chair. Mabel reached for it, and as she bent, the inner seam of her apron gave way with a small, treacherous sound. The miniature slipped free. It struck the floor once, a soft tap beneath the enormous silence, then slid across the polished wood. The gilt frame turned in the candlelight. It came to rest near Gideon Harrowby's black evening shoe. Mabel forgot how to breathe. For 1 second, no one understood what they had seen. It was only a small oval object on the floor. Too fine for a maid, too old to be a trinket bought with wages, too intimate to be explained. Then Sir Percival leaned forward. "What is that?" Cressida stood so quickly, her chair knocked against the wall behind her. "Mamma." Lady Redmarsh's face had gone white beneath its powder. Lord Redmarsh looked at the miniature, and all the anger left him, not softened, drained. Fear stood naked in its place before fury rushed in to cover it. "Pick that up," he said. His voice was low. "No," Gideon said. The word was not loud, but every person in the room obeyed it. Mabel remained on her knees, one hand still holding the napkin of broken crystal. She stared at the portrait near the Duke's shoe as if the little painted face had betrayed her by surviving. Lord Redmarsh recovered first. "Your Grace, that object is household property." "The girl must have stolen it from an attic or cabinet. Must she?" Gideon asked. "There can be no other explanation," Lady Redmarsh said, though her voice lacked the ease that usually made lies sound like manners. Sir Percival gave a dry little cough. "A servant with a lady's miniature hidden in her apron. I have seen dismissals for less." "It was my mother's," Mabel said. The words came out quiet, not pleading, not loud enough for drama. Just true enough to frighten her. Cressida laughed once too quickly. "Your mother? Really, Mabel, don't make it worse." Lord Redmarsh's gaze struck Mabel like a locked door. "Be silent." Gideon looked from him to Mabel. "No one will be silent until I understand why a keepsake has frightened this household more than broken glass." Lord Redmarsh's mouth tightened. "Your Grace oversteps." "I have not yet begun." The room held its breath. Gideon bent, picked up the miniature, and did so with a care that made Mabel's eyes sting more than accusation had. He did not pinch it between 2 fingers as stolen property. He lifted it as if age and grief deserved gentleness. Candlelight touched the glass. The painted woman looked upward from his palm. Calm grey eyes, blue ribbon, faded initials. Mabel watched the Duke's expression change, not surprise now. Recognition moved across his face, controlled and unmistakable. His hand stilled. The silence deepened until even Cressida's breathing sounded loud. Gideon turned the miniature slightly toward the light, and when he spoke, his voice had lost every trace of dinner-table courtesy. "That is no stolen trinket. I know that family face." The words seemed to strike the dining room before anyone had time to understand them. Mabel remained kneeling among the glittering shards. Napkin folded around broken crystal in one hand, her other hand resting against the floor, as if the polished boards might open beneath her and let her vanish. She had wished to be invisible for so long that being seen felt almost like danger. Yet the Duke of Westmere was looking not at her cap, not at her apron, not at the stain spreading near her knee, but at the miniature in his hand. His face had gone very still. The candlelight sharpened the hard line of his cheek and made his eyes appear darker than before. Lord Redmarsh recovered with the speed of a man accustomed to rescuing appearances before truth could reach the surface. "Your Grace is mistaken," he said. "The object is of no importance." A servant's theft made dramatic by embarrassment. Nothing more. Gideon did not look away from the portrait. I rarely mistake a face I have seen in a family gallery. Lady Redmarsh's fan opened with a pale snap. A gallery? How very curious. Many ladies resemble one another in miniature. Artists flatter. Servants invent. Surely this is not a matter for dinner. It ceased to be a matter for dinner when a girl on her knees was called a thief before 12 witnesses. The room held its breath again. Mabel felt the words pass over her like shelter, and that frightened her more than accusation. Shelter could be withdrawn. Accusations, at least, were familiar. Sir Percival Dane shifted in his chair. Your Grace, surely you do not mean to credit a maid's sentimental claim against the word of Lord Redmarsh. Gideon raised his eyes then. He did not raise his voice. He had no need. I mean to credit evidence before convenience. Lord Redmarsh's hand closed over the back of his chair. Evidence? A trinket hidden in an apron? A miniature of Lady Elspeth Arundel, unless memory and paint have both deceived me. The name changed the air. It was not dramatic in sound. Elspeth Arundel. 4 soft syllables and a family name almost dusted over by time. Yet Lady Redmarsh's lips parted. Cressida went motionless. Lord Redmarsh's expression did not break, but Mabel saw the effort required to keep it whole. She had spent 11 years reading danger in small movements, a pulse beating too hard in a throat. A ring turned once around a finger, a smile held after its meaning had died. Lady Elspeth Arundel died abroad, Lord Redmarsh said, years ago. Her family line ended in misfortune, as many do. So I was told. Gideon turned the miniature slightly. Yet this face hangs at Eastcombe Hall, covered and neglected, but not forgotten. My father's estate papers contained references to the Arundel Trust. Westmere had dealings with that family before I inherited. I saw the portrait myself 3 years ago, when the East Gallery was opened for inventory. Mabel heard the name Eastcombe as if someone had struck a hidden bell inside her. She did not know the place. She had never seen it. Yet the sound of it seemed to brush against something deep and unsteady, like a door at the end of a corridor. She had once walked in a dream. Eastcombe, Eastcombe. She lowered her head quickly, afraid her face would betray too much. Cressida found her voice with visible effort. How fascinating, Your Grace. But if that is true, it proves only that Mabel stole from Eastcombe, not that she belongs to anyone. A maid might pilfer an old keepsake from an abandoned house and invent a mother when caught. Mabel looked up. The shame of being named thief had been painful. The suggestion that her mother was an invention was worse. It moved through her with a coldness so clean that for a moment she did not feel fear at all. I did not steal it, she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried because the room was waiting for her to fail. I have had it since, before I came here. Lord Redmarsh turned on her. You will be silent. Mabel obeyed by instinct. Her throat closed. Gideon noticed. His gaze moved from Lord Redmarsh to her, and back again, and something in his expression hardened into decision. No, she will not be silenced, merely because her answer inconveniences you. Lady Redmarsh gave a strained laugh. Your Grace, you cannot mean to conduct an inquiry in the dining room. I agree. This room is unfit for it. There are too many people eager to condemn and too few willing to listen. The older lady beside Sir Percival inhaled sharply, but no one contradicted him. Dukes were not often contradicted in Mayfair drawing rooms, and almost never in dining rooms owned by men who needed their favor. Gideon stepped away from his chair and held the miniature out toward Mabel, but not close enough to force her to rise too quickly. Is this yours? The simplicity of the question nearly undid her. Not, where did you steal it? Not, who gave you leave? Not, what lie have you prepared? Is this yours? Mabel set the wrapped glass carefully on the floor, wiped her fingers against the clean edge of her apron, and stood. Her knees felt weak, but she would not sway before Cressida. She crossed the few feet between them with every gaze upon her. Yes, your grace. Who gave it to you? There was no answer that would not expose how little she possessed. My mother, I believe. Cressida gave a little sigh. You believe? Mabel turned her head. Memory is difficult when one is a child, and adults decide what must be forgotten. It was the bravest thing she had ever said in that house. She felt its danger at once. Lord Redmarsh's face darkened. Lady Redmarsh's fan went still. Gideon's eyes did not soften, but his attention changed. He had heard not a servant reaching above herself, but a witness speaking from the edge of a locked room. How old were you when you entered this household? He asked. I was told I was 10. Told? I had no papers, your grace. No trunk, no letters, only that. She nodded toward the miniature. And a ribbon. Lord Redmarsh laughed once. It was an ugly sound dressed in manners. This is absurd. The girl was taken in out of charity after her mother died in service. She has been fed, clothed, and employed. Now she repays kindness by spinning fantasies before my guests. Then you will have no objection to a proper account, Gideon said. An account? Of where she came from, who placed her here, and why a supposed charity child was permitted to keep a miniature of Lady Elspeth Arundel, while being told it was nothing. Lord Redmarsh's eyes flashed. I object to my household being insulted. Then relieve me of suspicion by answering plainly. The blow was not delivered with heat. That made it worse. Lord Redmarsh looked at the guests. He had expected curiosity to serve him. Instead, curiosity had turned its head toward the Duke. Lady Redmarsh rose slightly, then seemed to remember she could not flee her own table. This conversation must end, she said. The girl is overwrought. She will be dismissed in the morning, and the object returned to whatever cabinet she found it in. She will not be dismissed. Gideon's voice was quiet, absolute. Mabel stared at him. Dismissal had hung over her life like bad weather. It could arrive for a spot on linen, a misplaced ribbon, a word answered too clearly. To hear a man simply forbid it was so impossible that she did not know where to put her hands. Lord Redmarsh's politeness snapped. You have no authority over my servants. I have authority over my own presence in this house, and over the opinion I carry from it. If Miss Lane is turned out tonight, or in the morning, or before a chaperoned inquiry is held, every drawing room in London will hear that Redmarsh House feared a servant with a portrait. Miss Lane. Not girl, not maid, not thief. Mabel felt the name settle differently because he had spoken it without contempt. Sir Percival muttered, This is highly irregular. Gideon looked at him. So is accusing a woman of theft before examining what she carries. A flush crept up Sir Percival's neck. Cressida's mouth trembled with fury before she smoothed it into injury. Your Grace, surely you don't intend to make a heroine of her. No, Miss Fenwick. I intend to prevent cowards from making a criminal of her. The room froze. Cressida sat as if the chair had vanished beneath her. Lady Redmarsh looked at Lord Redmarsh, and in that glance Mabel saw not confusion, but calculation. This was not new to them. They might not have expected the Duke's recognition, but they had always known there was something to fear. Gideon turned to Mr. Alden, who had stood near the door in rigid misery. Send for a housekeeper and a suitable female witness. The young woman is to be given a chair in the morning room, and she is not to be questioned alone. Mr. Alden looked to Lord Redmarsh by habit. Gideon noticed. You may look to your master for wages. You will look to me for the consequences of refusing. Mr. Alden bowed at once. Yes, your Grace. Mabel could hardly breathe. A chair in the morning room, a witness. Questions asked where she might answer. It was not freedom, but it was the first door that had opened toward it. Gideon held the miniature out again. Miss Lane, do you wish this returned to your keeping? Her hand lifted before she could stop it, then halted in mid-air. If she took it, Lord Redmarsh would remember. If she did not, she might never see it again. Gideon waited. He did not hurry her. That waiting gave her courage. Yes, Your Grace. He placed the miniature in her palm. His glove brushed her fingers for the briefest instant, formal and careful. No impropriety, no possession, only restoration. Mabel closed her hand around the frame. Across the room, Lord Redmarsh watched the movement with such hatred that the little portrait seemed to burn against her skin. The dinner could not recover after that. Conversation returned in fragments, brittle and false, but the evening had already broken. Within 15 minutes, Lady Redmarsh pleaded a headache. Guests rose with murmured excuses. Mabel was sent from the room under Mrs. Pike's tight, worried supervision, the miniature once again hidden in her apron, but no longer secret in the same way. Above stairs, doors opened and closed. Below stairs, whispers scattered like mice. In the shadowed passage near the green baize door, Lord Redmarsh caught Lady Redmarsh by the wrist only long enough to stop her retreat. His voice was low, controlled, and colder than anger. Find where she sleeps. Find what else she has kept. Before Westmere asks another question, I want every scrap she owns in my hands. By the time the last carriage rolled away from Redmarsh House, the rooms above stairs had fallen into the kind of quiet that did not mean peace. Mabel knew that quiet. It came after doors had been closed too carefully, after family anger had been folded away from guests, after servants had been instructed to forget what every one of them had seen. She stood in the narrow passage outside the morning room, with the miniature pressed between both palms beneath her apron, waiting for someone to decide whether she was to be questioned, dismissed, or destroyed. Mrs. Pike stood beside her, rigid as a mourning figure. The housekeeper had said nothing since leading Mabel from the dining room, but once, when a footman passed too close, she shifted half an inch nearer to Mabel, as if even that small movement might count as protection. Across the hall, voices moved behind the closed drawing-room door. Lord Redmarsh's was low, Lady Redmarsh's was lower. Cressida's rose once, sharp with insult, then vanished under her mother's correction. Mabel kept her eyes on the carpet. She did not pray. Prayer had always felt dangerous in Redmarsh House, where hope gave pain a larger room to occupy. The morning-room door opened. Mr. Alden appeared with a face so carefully blank it seemed carved from wax. "Miss Lane," he said, and the title startled them both. "His Grace requests your presence." Mrs. Pike drew in a breath. "I will accompany her." "The Duchess Dowager of Westmere is within," Mr. Alden said. "As is Mrs. Wilton from Westmere House. His Grace was most particular." Mabel lifted her head. The Duchess Dowager. She had expected the Duke to demand answers. She had not expected him to build the room so that no one could later say she had tempted, lied, or spoken alone. That thought unsettled her. Care, when exact, was harder to mistrust. Mrs. Pike touched Mabel's sleeve. "Speak plainly. Do not embroider." "I have nothing to embroider," Mabel whispered. Then she entered. The morning room had always looked smaller from the doorway, a pale chamber with green curtains, a writing desk near the window, and a fire kept low so the wallpaper would not yellow. Tonight it felt like a court without a judge's bench. Gideon Harrowby stood near the mantel, one hand resting behind his back, his black evening coat severe against the soft room. Beside the sofa sat an elderly lady in deep violet silk, her white hair arranged beneath lace, her expression alert rather than gentle. Dowager Lady Westmere did not look like a woman easily shocked. Near the tea table stood another woman, plainly dressed, with a ring of household keys at her waist. Mrs. Wilton, Mabel assumed, housekeeper from Westmere House. Lord Redmarsh stood by the window with his mouth tight. Lady Redmarsh sat in the chair nearest the desk, her posture flawless, her eyes hard enough to cut glass. Cressida had not been permitted in. Mabel noticed that first, and knew the Duke had noticed everything. "Miss Lane," Gideon said. "You may sit." Lady Redmarsh's fan snapped open. "Your Grace, surely that is unnecessary." The dowager looked at her over the rim of her spectacles. "If the girl is to answer questions after being humiliated before half a dinner table, she may do so without standing like a culprit at the bar." Mabel did not move. Sitting in that room felt like stepping onto a frozen pond. She had polished those chair legs. She had carried coal to that hearth. Servants entered, served, and vanished. They did not sit. Gideon watched her hesitation, then drew the nearest chair back himself and stepped away from it. He did not touch her. He did not press. He made room, then let her decide whether to enter it. Mabel sat. The small act struck the room harder than raised voices would have done. Lady Redmarsh's face whitened. Lord Redmarsh looked toward the door, as if calculating which servant had seen. Gideon waited until Mabel's hands were folded in her lap. "You are not required to surrender the miniature," he said. "But I must ask whether you will allow us to see it again." Mabel's fingers tightened. There it was, the first demand wrapped in civility. Every adult who had ever taken something from her had begun by explaining that it was necessary. "No, Your Grace." Silence followed. Mrs. Wilton's eyes flickered. Lady Redmarsh made a soft sound of triumph. "There, you see, the girl is obstructive because she knows the object cannot bear inspection." Mabel's throat tightened, but she kept her gaze on Gideon. "I will hold it where you may look at it. I will not let it leave my hand." The Duke's eyes changed, not softened exactly, but warmed by one degree of understanding. "That is a reasonable condition." The dowager gave a small nod, as if Mabel had passed a test no one had announced. Mabel drew the miniature from the apron pocket. In the gentler light of the morning room, the painted woman looked less like a secret and more like a person interrupted in thought. Gideon stepped close enough to see, not close enough to crowd her. "The initials are E.A., he said. "Lady Elspeth Arundel." Lord Redmarsh spoke at once. "Speculation." "Memory," Gideon corrected. "And records, if they still exist where they ought to. Old records are unreliable. Only when someone has had reason to disturb them." Lady Redmarsh smiled thinly. "We are drifting into insult again." "No," the dowager said. "We have only reached the shore of it." Mabel looked down at the portrait. Her thumb rested along the worn gilt edge. "I do not know the lady's full name," she said. "I only know the face. I know I had it before this house. I know I was told never to lose it." Gideon's voice lowered. "Who told you?" For years she had avoided answering that question even to herself. If the voice in memory belonged to her mother, then her mother had existed as more than grief. If it did not, then Mabel had built her life around a dream. "A woman," she said. "I believe she was my mother." Lady Redmarsh leaned forward. "You believe? That is the whole matter, is it not?" A servant with a pretty face and a romantic imagination. Mabel looked at her then. The room seemed to narrow around that one cold, perfect face. "My lady, I was 10 years old when I was brought here, or so I was told. I had no trunk, no papers, no mourning dress, no explanation fit for a child. When I asked where my mother was, I was told gratitude would serve me better than questions." The dowager's expression sharpened. Gideon did not move at all. "Who brought you?" he asked. Mabel closed her eyes briefly. A carriage smell, damp wool, a woman crying into a handkerchief, a man's voice saying the family peace required quiet. "I remember a woman named Bexley, Mrs. Bexley, perhaps. She wept when she left me. She said I must obey Lord Redmarsh, and that one day someone would come who remembered." Lord Redmarsh laughed. It was too quick. "Bexley? Common enough name. We have employed dozens." "Have you?" Gideon asked. "Then you will not object to producing the household books." Lady Redmarsh rose halfway from her chair. Our household books are not yours to examine. No, they are Lord Redmarsh's to explain. Mabel felt the miniature warm in her palm. There was a ribbon too, she said. Blue. It was tied around the portrait. When I was small, I kept it in a tin box. Gideon's gaze fixed on her. Blue? Yes, Your Grace. A pale blue with a narrow silver edge. Mabel stared at him. I think so. The dowager turned toward her son's empty place by the mantel, though he stood near the chair, as if old memory had crossed the room between them. Westmere blue, she said quietly. No, Gideon said, Arundel blue. Their livery used silver edging on formal ribbons. My father complained of the expense in one of his account notes. Lord Redmarsh's hand struck the window frame, not violently enough to break anything, but sharply enough that every head turned. This is madness. You are building a lineage out of ribbon and servant dreams. Gideon looked at him for a long moment. And you are very eager to prevent those dreams being tested. Lady Redmarsh stood. This has gone far enough. The girl has disturbed our guests, concealed property, contradicted her betters, and now sits in my morning room, weaving family romance from household scraps. She will sleep below stairs tonight. In the morning, she will leave without a character. That is mercy. Mabel felt the blow of it even before fear arrived. Without a character, a servant was nearly unemployable. It was a quieter ruin than prison, and often enough to finish a woman. Gideon's face went still in a way that made the fire seem suddenly louder. She will not. You cannot keep another household's servant. I can remove my confidence from a house that threatens a young woman for answering questions I asked. Lord Redmarsh stepped forward. Careful, Westmere. The dowager rose then. She was small, older, and wrapped in violet silk, but the room altered around her. My lord, you are addressing a duke in your own house as though rank were a coat one might take off at dinner. Recollect yourself. Lord Redmarsh stopped. Colour crept up his face. Gideon did not look away from him. Miss Lane will remain under appropriate protection until this matter is settled. If she chooses to leave Redmarsh House tonight, my mother will receive her at Westmere House with Mrs. Wilton in attendance. If she chooses to remain here until morning, I will have a footman from my household waiting at the door and a note sent to my solicitor before breakfast. The choice turned toward Mabel like sudden light. She had been ordered all her life. Stand there. Look down. Carry this. Forget that. Do not ask. Be grateful. Now the room waited for her answer. It should have felt like freedom. It felt enormous. I cannot leave yet, she said. Lady Redmarsh's smile returned, naturally. Mabel looked at Gideon before that smile could poison the words. There is a tin box in the servants' attic. The ribbon is there and perhaps other things. If I leave without it, I may never see it again. The Duke understood at once. So did Lord Redmarsh. His face closed like a locked gate. Servants' belongings are subject to inspection. Not tonight, Gideon said. Mabel stood, the miniature clutched carefully in her hand. She had expected the words to tremble, but they did not. I will go to Westmere House under Her Grace's protection. But first I must retrieve what is mine. The dowager's eyes rested on her with something close to approval. Gideon inclined his head, grave and exact. Then we shall see that you do. Mabel had climbed the back stairs of Redmarsh House thousands of times, carrying coal, linen, trays, and messages that were never meant for her ears. But she had never felt each step count against her as it did that night. The servants' staircase rose in narrow turns, away from candlelit rooms and polished respectability, toward the low attic where trunks were stored, old uniforms were patched, and inconvenient lives were expected to fold themselves into silence. Mrs. Pike went beside her, with a candle in one hand and her mouth pressed thin. Behind them followed Mrs. Wilton from Westmere House, calm and watchful, and a young housemaid who had been summoned to make the errand proper. Mabel had asked for Mrs. Pike herself. She did not trust many people in Redmarsh House, but the housekeeper had once left broth beside her bed when fever took half the servants below stairs, and had pretended not to notice when Mabel was too weak to carry her tray. That kind of mercy was small. In a hard house, small mercy became a language. "You are certain it is still there?" Mrs. Pike asked as they reached the top landing. "No," Mabel said. The answer came honestly before pride could improve it. "But it was there yesterday morning. Then find it quickly." The candlelight trembled over the attic door. "If Lady Redmarsh reaches this room before you do, every rag in it will be turned inside out." Mabel did not answer. She already knew. She had spent 11 years hiding her life in places no one important wished to touch. In a cracked jar behind the laundry copper, she had once kept a ribbon for 3 months until a scullery maid found it and asked too many questions. In a loose brick near the coal hole, she had hidden a little scrap of paper until damp took the ink. The tin box had survived because it looked worthless, because it was wedged behind a broken warming pan and beneath 2 moth-eaten blankets that smelled of dust and old winters. Mrs. Pike unlocked the attic door. Cold air breathed out. The space under the roof was long and low, with beams crossing overhead and trunks pushed into shadows. Rain whispered somewhere beyond the slates, soft enough to sound secretive. Mabel took the candle from Mrs. Pike and ducked inside. The young housemaid stayed near the door, looking frightened. Mrs. Wilton stepped in after Mabel and examined nothing with her hands, only with her eyes. That restraint comforted Mabel more than a speech would have done. The corner was exactly as she had left it, yet not quite. The warming pan had shifted. 1 blanket lay on the floor. Mabel's breath caught. "Someone has been here." Mrs. Pike's face tightened. "Then move, child." Mabel knelt. Her fingers searched behind the slanted beam past dust, splinters, and the rough edge of old plaster. For 1 terrible second, she felt nothing. Empty space. Then metal touched her fingertips. She drew out the tin box and clutched it against her chest. It was smaller than a Bible, dented at one corner, with a rusted lid that opened only if pressed in a certain place. No jewel case had ever seemed more precious, Mrs. Wilton closed the attic door halfway, leaving it open enough to show propriety, and closed enough to muffle the servant's stare. "Look inside before we leave," she said. "If anyone claims it held something else, there should be witnesses." Mabel nodded. Her hands were steady until the latch gave. Inside lay the faded blue ribbon, folded around a child's glove, so small it made her throat ache. Beneath it rested a torn scrap of paper with the edge scorched brown. A second fragment, thinner and brittle, had been tucked beneath the lining. She did not remember placing it there. Perhaps she had been too young. Perhaps someone else had hidden it for her. She lifted the first scrap toward the candle. The ink had faded, but 1 word showed clearly. Eastcombe. Below it, half a line remained, delivered into the care of Mrs. Bexley until further instruction. "Mrs. Bexley," Mabel whispered. The name was no longer a misted sound from childhood. It had ink, it had shape. Mrs. Pike leaned closer. "I knew a Bexley once." "Nursery maid, perhaps. Not here." Mabel looked up quickly. "Where?" "I cannot swear to it." Mrs. Pike's caution closed over her face. "Servants pass through houses. Names pass with them." Before Mabel could ask more, the attic door opened wide. Miss Cressida Fenwick stood there in her blue silk, with no shawl and no proper reason to be near the servants' rooms. Candlelight caught the pearls in her hair and turned her beauty cold. The young housemaid shrank back. Mrs. Pike straightened. "Miss Fenwick, this is no place for you. Clearly it is no place for honesty either." Cressida's gaze went at once to the open tin box. Mama said there would be more. How industrious you are, Mabel. One little performance downstairs, and now you are gathering props for the next. Mabel closed the tin box, but not before Cressida saw the ribbon. These are mine. Nothing in this house is yours. Cressida stepped forward. Mrs. Wilton moved subtly between her and the door, but Cressida ignored her. Did you think His Grace would marry you for a scrap of ribbon and a pretty lie? Or perhaps you only hope he will set you up somewhere, out of pity. The words did not strike as deeply as Cressida intended. For years, shame had taught Mabel to bend before it. Tonight, after sitting in the morning room and hearing her own answer matter, something in her refused the old shape. You may command my work, Miss Fenwick, she said. You may not command my memory. Cressida's face changed. The sweetness vanished so completely that Mabel wondered how anyone upstairs had ever believed in it. Your memory, she said. You scrubbed grates until yesterday. Do you imagine a duke's glance has made you a lady? No. Mabel stood with the box in one hand and the miniature hidden beneath her apron with the other. But your fear has made me wonder why you need me to remain a maid. Cressida moved too quickly for dignity. She reached for Mabel's apron, not striking, not openly enough to be called violence, but with a sharp little grab, meant to seize and humiliate. Mabel stepped back. The ribbon slipped from the tin and fluttered onto the floor between them. Cressida bent for it. Mabel bent too, and for one breath they were both crouched beneath the attic beams, the master's daughter and the servant girl, each reaching for the same faded strip of blue. Mabel caught it first. Cressida's gloved fingers closed around the edge and pulled. The old silk tore with a soft, dreadful sound. Mabel froze. The torn end remained in Cressida's hand. The rest lay curled in Mabel's palm. For a moment, neither woman spoke. The sound had been small, but it seemed to fill every hidden year of Mabel's life. Cressida looked at the torn piece, then smiled because she understood she had hurt something no one else could price. There, she said. Now it suits you better. Mabel closed her fingers over the ribbon. Her voice came out low. Give that back. Or what? Cressida whispered. Will you tell His Grace I damaged your royal relic? Mrs. Pike stepped forward. Miss Fenwick, enough. You forget yourself, Pike. No, miss. I remember exactly where I am. That answer startled even Mrs. Pike. It also cost her. Mabel saw it in the sudden pallor of the housekeeper's face. Then footsteps sounded on the stairs below. Not hurried. Certain. Cressida turned toward the door just as Gideon Harrowby entered the attic, landing with Dowager Lady Westmere behind him and a Westmere footman holding another candle. The Duke took in the scene in a single glance. The open tin box, the torn ribbon, Cressida's gloved hand, Mabel's face. Miss Fenwick, he said, you are very far from the drawing-room. Cressida recovered with admirable speed. I came to prevent a theft. Gideon looked at the ribbon in her hand. Then begin by returning what you are holding. Color rushed into her cheeks. It is a rag. Then you lose nothing by surrendering it. The Dowager held out her hand. Cressida hesitated, then placed the torn scrap into the older woman's palm as if it burned. Gideon turned to Mabel. May I see what you found? The question again. May I? Not give it here, not obey. Mabel opened the tin box. He did not take it from her. He leaned close enough to read the scorched fragment while the footman held the candle. His expression altered when he saw the handwriting beneath the word Eastcombe. This hand, he said slowly, is familiar. Lady Westmere looked up. From where? My father's old solicitor. Gideon's voice had gone quiet, but something dangerous moved beneath it. A man named Alcott, who handled Westmere correspondence connected to the Arundel accounts. Cressida laughed. How convenient. Gideon removed one glove, folded it, and held it out to Mabel. Wrap the miniature in this until your pocket can be mended. She looked at him, startled. Your Grace, I cannot take your glove. You can, it will protect the glass. So little was said. So much was understood. He had seen the torn ribbon. He had seen that Cressida wished to damage what Mabel loved, because she could not yet destroy what it proved. Mabel drew out the miniature and wrapped it in the fine black leather with careful hands. Cressida watched, her mouth tight with fury. You are making a spectacle of servant sentiment, she said. Gideon's gaze did not leave Mabel. No, Miss Fenwick, I am preserving evidence your family appears remarkably anxious to ruin. The word evidence changed the attic. It made the ribbon, the glove, the burned note, and the portrait more than poor scraps kept by a lonely girl. It made them dangerous to those who had laughed at them. Mabel closed the tin box. The torn ribbon lay safely inside again, both pieces together. For the first time since she was a child, she felt that memory might not be a weakness. It might be a witness. Then Gideon lifted the scorched scrap toward the candle, and the half-burned name of Mrs. Bexley trembled in the light, like a person trying to return from the dead. Mabel left Redmarsh House before dawn in a carriage that did not belong to Lord Redmarsh, and that single fact made the whole square feel altered. No footman in Redmarsh livery handed her up. No order from Lady Redmarsh decided which cloak she might wear. Mrs. Wilton took the tin box from Mrs. Pike, only long enough to settle it safely beside Mabel on the seat, then returned it to Mabel's hands, as though the little dented thing were a jewel case entrusted by a queen. The gesture nearly undid her. Kindness, when it came without performance, was more difficult to bear than cruelty. Cruelty had rules. Kindness asked her to believe in a world that had given her little evidence. Across from her, Dowager Lady Westmere sat wrapped in dark velvet, her gloved hands folded over the silver head of her cane. She had insisted on coming in the carriage herself, not sending it like charity. Beside Mabel sat Mrs. Wilton, straight-backed and silent, and opposite the window rode the Duke of Westmere, his face half-shadowed as London's lamps slid past the glass. Gideon had said almost nothing since the attic. Yet his silence did not feel like Redmarsh silence. It did not demand that she disappear. It seemed to be making space for whatever she could not yet say. The miniature, wrapped in his glove, lay in her lap above the tin box. Mabel kept one hand over it. The leather was warm from her own palm now, but she remembered the moment he had offered it. Not pity, not gallantry for an audience, practical care. That made it harder to distrust. You are cold, the Dowager said at last. No, Your Grace, that was not a question. Mabel looked down. A little, perhaps. The Dowager tapped the roof once with her cane. Mrs. Wilton, the rug. Mrs. Wilton unfolded a carriage rug and laid it over Mabel's knees before Mabel could protest. Gideon's gaze moved to her face, then away again, as if he understood that gratitude could feel too exposed in the narrow space of a carriage. You will be received as a guest under my mother's protection, he said, not as a servant borrowed from Redmarsh House. The word guest struck her almost painfully. Your Grace, I do not know how to be that. Few people know how to be anything the first time society permits it. The Dowager gave him a dry look. And some never learn despite years of practice. Mabel almost smiled, then caught herself. Smiling in a duke's carriage before dawn, while leaving the only house she remembered, was too strange for safety. The carriage turned toward Grosvenor Street, where Westmere House stood broader and more severe than Redmarsh House, without the strained glitter of a family trying to prove itself. There were lamps in the hall when they arrived, but no crowd of curious servants. Mrs. Wilton had arranged that. A single footman opened the door. A maid waited with hot water. No one stared openly at Mabel's apron, her cap, or the tin box held against her ribs. That restraint felt deliberate. It felt like another kind of shelter. "You will sleep first," the dowager said as they entered. "Questions can wait until daylight has manners enough to attend them. I am not certain I could sleep. Then you will lie down and disappoint wakefulness." Mabel obeyed because the command had no cruelty in it. The small room prepared for her faced the back garden, not the servants' court. It had a narrow bed, a washstand, a chair, and curtains of plain cream wool. Nothing extravagant. Nothing that suggested she had been dressed for a fairy tale. On the bed lay a folded grey gown, simple and modest, with clean linen beside it. Mabel touched the fabric with 2 fingers. It was not silk. It was not livery. It was ordinary in a way that felt almost merciful. When the maid offered to help her undress, Mabel flinched before she could stop herself. The girl stepped back at once. "Mrs. Wilton said, you might prefer to manage alone, miss. Mabel shut her eyes. "Thank you." Alone, she removed the black servant's dress, with hands that trembled only once. She set the apron on the chair and took out the portrait, the ribbon pieces, the burned scrap, and the little glove. She arranged them on the washstand because she could not yet bear to put them out of sight. Then she sat on the bed in her shift and grey wool dressing wrapper, listening to a house where no one shouted her name from the stairs. Sleep did not come. Memory did. Cressida's hand closing on the ribbon, Lady Redmarsh's cold certainty, Lord Redmarsh's order in the passage. Find what else she has kept. Near sunrise, Mabel rose, dressed in the grey gown, and braided her hair without a cap. She looked into the small mirror and saw neither maid nor lady, only a young woman caught between 2 lies. That was when a knock came. Mrs. Wilton entered with tea and toast, followed by the dowager, who carried folded papers beneath one arm. "His Grace asks whether you will come to the library," the dowager said. "He has found something. You may refuse." Mabel's fingers closed over the back of the chair. "I will come." The Westmere Library was not warm in the sentimental way of novels. It was organized, high-windowed and stern, with ledgers stacked beside calf-bound volumes and estate maps rolled in neat drawers. Gideon stood at a long table, sleeves still perfectly ordered despite the hour, as if he had not slept either. He turned when Mabel entered. For a moment, he did not speak. His gaze took in the grey gown, her uncovered hair, the tin box in her hands. Something softened and vanished before she could name it. "Miss Lane," he said. "Thank you for coming." She almost corrected him. She almost said she was not Miss anything. But the dowager had taken a chair near the window, and Mrs. Wilton remained by the door, and nothing in the room asked Mabel to shrink. "You found something, Your Grace." Gideon opened a leather portfolio. A sketch copied from the Eastcombe Hall inventory. He turned the paper toward her. Mabel had prepared herself for resemblance. She had not prepared herself for recognition. The woman on the page was older than the miniature, drawn from a full portrait, rather than painted in delicate color, but the eyes were the same. Calm grey eyes, Mabel's eyes, the same tilt of brow. The same shape of mouth that seemed at once composed and sorrowful. Her breath left her quietly. The room did not move. Gideon did not rush to fill the silence. At last Mabel reached toward the sketch but stopped before touching it. "Is that Lady Elspeth?" "Yes," his voice was low. "The inventory names her as Lady Elspeth Arundel, wife of Captain Rowan Arundel. Eastcombe Hall passed into uncertainty after their deaths. There is reference to a minor child, but the file becomes confused afterward. A minor child." Mabel repeated the words as if they belonged to someone else. Not a servant found out of charity. No, the answer was too simple to hide inside. Mabel looked again at the sketch. She had spent years thinking grief made people invent resemblance because the heart could not bear emptiness. But paper did not grieve, ink did not flatter her. "If she is my mother," she said, and stopped. The word mother seemed too large for the room. Gideon waited. "If she is my mother, why did no one come?" The question was not accusation, yet pain sharpened it. Gideon accepted the edge. "I don't know. But I intend to find out. Because of the Arundel Trust? Because a child appears to have been hidden." He paused. "And because last night a household attempted to punish a woman for carrying the only proof that she had ever belonged to anyone." Mabel looked away before he could see too much. "Would you still seek the truth if I remained only a maid?" Gideon's answer came without delay, most especially then. No compliment could have struck more deeply. Compliments could be manners, and manners could be lies. But that answer gave her worth before it gave her rank. The dowager unfolded one of the papers she carried. "There is more. Not proof, but trouble." She laid a scandal sheet on the table. The ink was fresh enough to smudge. Mabel read only the boldest line before the rest blurred. "The portrait maid under Westmere protection." Beneath it, a cruel little paragraph suggested that a duke's interest in a pretty servant could only have one explanation. Heat flooded her face. She stepped back. "I have brought shame to your house." "No," Gideon said. The coldness in his voice was not for her. "Someone has tried to send shame ahead of truth." The dowager tapped the paper. "London will dine on this by evening unless given something better to chew." Mabel gripped the edge of the table. "What does that mean?" The older woman studied her with sharp, not unkind eyes. "It means hiding you completely. May allow them to write your story for you." Gideon's expression tightened, but he said nothing. Mabel noticed the restraint. He did not decide aloud over her head. The dowager folded the scandal sheet once, crisply. "A morning music-hale is to be held tomorrow at Lady Castleton's. Half the women who pretend to govern Mayfair will attend. If you remain unseen, you become whatever Redmarsh says you are. If you are seen under my protection, they must at least wonder." The idea struck Mabel with fear so immediate she felt it in her knees. A room of ladies, whispering, measuring, laughing behind fans. She looked at the sketch of Lady Elspeth, then at the miniature wrapped carefully in the Duke's black glove. For 11 years she had survived by lowering her eyes. Now survival seemed to require lifting them. Gideon spoke quietly. "You do not have to go." The words should have relieved her. Instead, they gave her the courage to consider going. Mabel touched the edge of the grey sleeve. Not livery, not borrowed splendor, something between. "If I go," she said, "I will not pretend to be what I cannot prove." The dowager's mouth curved by the smallest degree. "Excellent. Society has quite enough people doing that already." Gideon looked at Mabel then, and in his gaze she saw not rescue, not pity, but a grave recognition that the next step belonged to her. The scandal sheet lay between them like a challenge. The sketch of Lady Elspeth waited beside it like a question. Mabel placed one hand over the tin box. "Then let them see me," she said, "before Lord Redmarsh teaches them how not to." The next morning, Mabel learned that being seen could feel very much like being placed beneath glass. Lady Castleton's house stood 3 streets from Grosvenor Square, elegant without warmth. Its drawing rooms opened for a morning music-hale where ladies gathered to admire harp, soprano, and one another's gowns with equal discipline. Mabel arrived in the dowager Lady Westmere's carriage, wearing the plain grey dress Mrs. Wilton had altered before breakfast. It had no lace at the throat, no silk trimming at the sleeves, and nothing that tried to persuade society. She was more than the truth could prove. The only colour she wore was the faded blue ribbon, mended as well as it could be, folded inside the small reticule the dowager had lent her. The miniature remained wrapped in the Duke's black glove and hidden near her heart. Gideon had not ridden in the carriage. Propriety demanded that he arrive separately. Yet, when the footman handed Mabel down, she saw him already on the pavement near the entrance, speaking to an older gentleman as if he had not placed himself there precisely to witness her arrival. His gaze found hers. He did not smile. Somehow that steadied her more than a smile would have done. A smile might have promised comfort. His stillness promised attention. "Remember," the dowager said beside her, lowering her voice as they approached the door. "They will look because they have been told to look. Let them. Looking is not the same as knowing." "And if they laugh?" Mabel asked. "Then they confess the poverty of their imagination." The butler announced them with correct solemnity. The Dowager Lady Westmere, Miss Lane. The name moved through the room before Mabel did. Conversations thinned. Fans paused. A soprano near the pianoforte held a sheet of music but no longer looked at it. Mabel stepped across the carpet at the dowager's side, aware of every inch of space between her plain hem and the silks around her. She had crossed rooms like this carrying trays, invisible unless something spilled. Now the room saw her and seemed offended by the effort required. Lady Castledon, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, came forward. She was one of those women whose approval could polish a reputation and whose silence could bruise one for years. "Lady Westmere," she said, "you are most welcome." Her gaze turned to Mabel. It rested on her face, then on the dress, then on her ungloved hands. "Miss Lane." The title was spoken not kindly but correctly. For the moment that was enough. The dowager inclined her head. "Lady Castledon." "Miss Lane has come under my protection." The words entered the room like a chair placed firmly before a door. Not everyone liked the obstruction. Mabel heard the whispers gather behind fans as the first song began. Portrait maid, Redmarsh servant, Westmere's charity, or worse. She kept her hands folded and her gaze steady upon the harpist's fingers. The music was delicate, bright, and almost useless against the weight of eyes. She could feel Gideon across the room, though she did not look for him at once. When she finally allowed herself one glance, he was standing near the mantel with a glass untouched in his hand. A lady in green attempted conversation at his elbow. He answered her without removing his attention from the circle forming around Mabel. That circle tightened after the second piece. Lady Castledon offered tea. Chairs shifted. The room softened into those little social islands where reputations were made to drown politely. Then Miss Cressida Fenwick entered with her mother. Mabel knew the change before she saw them. The whispers sharpened. Lady Redmarsh wore lavender silk and a face of wounded dignity. Cressida wore white muslin trimmed in blue, a choice so deliberate that Mabel felt the insult before anyone spoke it. In her gloved hands she carried a small velvet case. Lord Redmarsh followed moments later, though gentlemen were not always so eager for morning music. His presence turned unease into design. "Lady Westmere," Lady Redmarsh said, with a bow so shallow it was nearly an accusation. "How brave of you to come." The dowager looked at her over the rim of her spectacles. "At my age, Lady Redmarsh, arriving anywhere before noon is bravery enough." A few ladies coughed into their tea. Cressida smiled and stepped into the center of the room. "I had hoped to avoid this painful matter in public." No one believed her. Everyone listened. "But since Miss Lane has been brought here under a misapprehension, I feel bound to protect several families from embarrassment." Mabel's fingers tightened around her reticule. The miniature seemed to press against her heart through the layers of cloth. Gideon moved away from the mantel. Not far. Enough. Lord Redmarsh placed a hand on Cressida's shoulder in a display of paternal sorrow. "My daughter has been distressed since discovering that a servant from our household concealed property belonging to Eastcombe Hall. Mabel heard a woman whisper, "Eastcombe?" Another answered, "Arundel, I think." Cressida opened the velvet case. Inside lay a miniature portrait. For 1 second, Mabel's mind refused what her eyes saw. The painted lady resembled the woman in her own portrait. Grey eyes, pale skin, a blue suggestion near the shoulder. The frame was newer, too bright at the edge, but from a distance it could deceive. Cressida lifted it for the room. This was found among old effects connected to Eastcombe. As you see, the design is easily copied. A maid who spent years near household cupboards could steal one small object and build a romance around it, the room murmured. Mabel felt the floor tilt beneath her, but she did not step back. The humiliation was clever because it did not shout. It offered society permission to doubt her while feeling prudent. Lady Redmarsh sighed. "We were charitable to the girl, perhaps too charitable. She has always been given to invention." Gideon's voice cut through the murmurs. Given to invention is a convenient phrase when evidence becomes inconvenient. Lord Redmarsh turned to him. "Your Grace, I had hoped to spare you further involvement." "Had you?" Gideon asked. "You have chosen a curious method." Cressida's smile thinned. "Surely even your Grace must admit that 2 portraits weaken her tale." Mabel looked at the copy. Her fear began to clear. It did not vanish, but it thinned enough for thought to pass through. The blue at the shoulder was wrong, too broad, no silver edge, no tiny break in the ribbon where age had worn the original paint. Whoever had made the copy had seen the face or been told of it, but had not known the details hidden by love and long keeping. Mabel drew a breath. "That is not mine." Cressida tilted her head. "No one said it was, Mabel. That is the point. A few women." Smiled. Mabel felt the old lesson rise. "Be quiet. Lower your eyes. Do not make it worse." Then she remembered the dowager's words. "Looking is not the same as knowing." She lifted her chin. "My portrait has a narrow silver edge on the blue ribbon. There is a flaw in the paint near the left side of the frame where the glass cracked long ago. The initials are faded because someone once tried to clean them away." The room quieted. Cressida's fingers shifted around the velvet case. Mabel saw it and knew Gideon had seen it too. "This copy has none of that," Mabel continued. Her voice shook once, then steadied. "It is a likeness made by someone who knew there was a portrait, but not by someone who had held it every night as a child." Lady Redmarsh's expression hardened. "How touching." Lord Redmarsh spoke over her. "Enough. This is precisely the performance I feared." A servant reciting details fed to her by those who wish to make mischief of old family sorrow. Gideon stepped closer, but did not stand before Mabel. He came beside her, leaving her visible. "If it is performance, why did your daughter bring a copy prepared before Miss Lane ever described those details in this room?" Cressida's mouth opened. No answer came quickly enough. Lady Castledon looked from Cressida to the portrait case, and in that measuring glance Mabel saw the first crack in public certainty. Lord Redmarsh sensed it too. His face settled into grave injury. "Westmere, consider what you risk. You are a duke of ancient name. Will you attach that name to a maid's fantasy and drag your house through scandal?" The room waited. There it was. The choice placed in full view. Mabel felt it like a hand at her back, pushing her toward abandonment. She could almost see the story society would prefer. The Duke would step away, regret his moment of curiosity, and she would become an amusing error whispered over tea until Redmarsh House reclaimed and crushed her. Gideon looked at Lord Redmarsh for a long moment. "My house has survived worse than truth." Something in Mabel loosened. Not hope yet. Hope was too large, but she could breathe. Lady Redmarsh snapped her fan shut. "Then you mean to protect her? I mean to hear her." Gideon turned to Mabel and offered his arm, not as rescue forced upon her, but as a question in front of them all. She looked at it. If she took it, the room would say she was bold. If she refused, they would say she knew herself unworthy. There was no safe answer, so she chose the honest one. She placed her hand lightly on his sleeve. "I want the truth," she said, facing Lady Castledon, Lady Redmarsh, Cressida, and every fan that had paused to judge her. Not rank, not pity, not revenge. Only the truth of who left me in that house and why. No one laughed. That more than kindness changed the air. The dowager rose. "Lady Castledon, your musicale has been most instructive." Lady Castledon gave a slow nod. Indeed, Gideon escorted Mabel from the room with the dowager at her other side. Behind them, whispers burst open, but they no longer sounded like certainty. They sounded like fear, learning to ask questions. Only when they reached the carriage did Mabel's strength falter. Gideon helped the dowager in first, then turned to Mabel. "You did well." She looked at him, still hearing Lord Redmarsh's challenge echo through the room. "Did I?" "They still think I may be lying." "No," Gideon said. "Now they are afraid you may be telling the truth." The carriage door closed. As the horses moved into the street, Gideon's face grew grave. "Until proof is complete, you must be kept from society's teeth." Mabel stared at the passing houses, her hand still remembering the weight of his sleeve. Kept from society, kept. The word folded around her like a lock. For the first time since leaving Redmarsh House, the old prison seemed to find her again. By the time the carriage returned to Westmere House, the morning had already begun to turn against Mabel. It was not visible in the sky, which remained a mild London grey, or in the street, where horses moved through damp air and flower sellers called from corners as if nothing had changed. It was visible in the way footmen looked away too quickly. It was visible in the closed doors of nearby houses, where curtains shifted at the edges. It was visible in Gideon Harrowby's silence, which had become harder since the musicale, not unkind, but sealed around a decision he had not yet spoken. Mabel sat with the dowager opposite her, her gloved hands folded over the reticule that held the torn blue ribbon. The miniature remained wrapped in the Duke's black glove beneath her cloak, close enough that she could feel its shape when the carriage turned. She had walked into Lady Castledon's house as a question. She had left it as a scandal. That was how society worked. It took a woman's wound, held it up to the light, and called the examination entertainment. At Westmere House, Mrs. Wilton received them without surprise, but even her calm carried urgency. A folded sheet lay on the silver salver in the hall. The dowager took it, read 3 lines, and her mouth tightened. Already, Gideon removed his hat. "What is it?" "Lady Castledon's drawing room has a faster circulation than the Morning Post." She handed him the paper. He read it once, his face giving away nothing, and then placed it on the table where Mabel could see. A new paragraph had been added to the scandal sheet. "The Duke's charity maid retreats from questions. Redmarsh family injured by ingratitude." Mabel felt the words settle on her like dirty water. She did not reach for the paper. Touching it would make it no truer and no less poisonous. "They think I ran," she said. "They were always going to write something," Gideon replied. "Then, why does it feel as if they have written me smaller?" The question escaped before she could make it polite. Gideon looked at her, and for the first time since the carriage, his composure cracked enough to show concern. "Because that is what they intend." The dowager studied him sharply. "And what do you intend?" He did not answer at once. That was when Mabel knew. A decision made in silence had already begun moving through the house before she was invited to hear it. Gideon led them into the library, where a map of Sussex lay open across the table. A house was marked near the southern coast, half a day from London, by changing horses. Keldham Priory, the Westmere estate in Sussex. The name had been written in careful black ink beside a cluster of woods and pale roads. "Keldham is quiet," Gideon said, "properly staffed. My mother's companion can go with you, and Mrs. Wilton will send 2 maids. No one in Mayfair can reach you there without passing through my people first. My solicitor can continue the search for records. When we have proof enough to silence Redmarsh, you may return." The words were reasonable. That made them more painful. Mabel stared at the map. Quiet, properly staffed, out of reach. All the phrases sounded like safety, until they turned in her mind and showed their bars. "You have arranged this already. I arranged the possibility, without asking me." Gideon's jaw tightened. "After what happened this morning, delay is dangerous." "For whom?" The dowager did not interrupt. Mrs. Wilton, standing near the door, lowered her eyes. The room became very still. Gideon answered carefully, "For you." "No." Mabel looked at the map again, at the neat black letters, deciding where her fear should be housed. "For Westmere. For scandal. For a story that has become inconvenient before it has become useful." His face changed. Not anger. Something struck deeper because it did not defend itself quickly enough. "That is not fair. Perhaps not." Her voice trembled and she steadied it with effort. "But it is familiar." He took one step toward her and stopped. "Miss Lane, I am trying to keep you from being torn apart by a society that has already decided cruelty is amusement. I believe you." That seemed to surprise him. "Then, why do you look as though I have betrayed you?" Mabel drew the black glove from beneath her cloak. The miniature was inside it, safe, protected, wrapped in fine leather that did not belong to her. She laid it on the table between them. "Because protection without voice feels very much like being hidden. Lord Redmarsh hid me in a household. Lady Redmarsh hid me in a cap and apron. Cressida tried to hide me beneath laughter. If you send me away before I choose it, you will have hidden me beneath kindness." Gideon looked at the glove, then at her. The words had reached him. She saw that they had. But men born to authority did not easily abandon the instinct to command danger into order. "If you remain in London, they will strike again. Then let me know where they strike from. That is precisely what I am attempting to discover." "No. You are sending solicitors to discover it, while I wait in another house to be told who I am." The silence that followed was the most honest thing in the room. Mabel reached for the glove, then stopped and pushed it gently toward him. "Your Grace, I cannot be protected by being erased." He did not take it. "Keep it." No. The refusal cost her more than she expected. The glove had become proof of care. Returning it felt like returning warmth. "If I keep it now, I will begin to mistake your care for permission to disappear." The dowager's cane tapped once against the floor. "Gideon." There was warning in the single word. Gideon looked toward his mother, then back to Mabel. "What would you have me do? Ask me." The answer was simple. It stood in the room like a candle. His expression altered again, and this time shame moved across it, controlled but visible. Before he could speak, a footman entered with a letter on a salver. "For Miss Lane, Your Grace." Delivered at the servant's entrance by a boy who would not wait. Mabel did not move. Gideon's eyes sharpened. "You may read it here, or not at all." It was the right thing to say. He was learning even while wounded. Mabel took the letter. The paper was cheap, but the hand was careful, disguised perhaps, yet not disguised enough to feel honest. There was no seal. Inside lay a banknote and 4 sentences. "For the peace of the family, accept what is offered and leave England quietly. No one will believe you. No one will forgive what your pride will cost." A woman without a name should be grateful for money enough to buy another one. Mabel read it twice before the words settled into sense. The banknote slipped from her fingers onto the carpet. "For the peace of the family," she whispered. The library disappeared for a moment. A carriage smell returned, damp wool, a woman crying, a man's voice near the door. For the peace of the family, the child must be quiet. Gideon was beside her before she had fully returned to the room, though still he did not touch her. You have heard that phrase before. Yes, her voice sounded distant to her own ears. When I was brought to Redmarsh House, I remember it now, the dowager rose. Then the letter was a mistake. Mabel looked at the page. Fear had sent it, and fear had spoken too clearly. Mrs. Bexley may remember who said it. Gideon turned. We will locate her. His eyes narrowed, not in command this time, in concern. Not alone, no, not alone. With a proper companion. Mabel folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the map, where Keldham Priory waited like a beautiful locked room. But I will not go to Sussex and wait to be summoned back into my own life. Gideon stood silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he took up the glove she had returned. He did not put it on. He held it as if it had become evidence against him. I was wrong, he said. The words were quiet enough that only those in the room could hear. They mattered because they were not polished for society. I thought concealment would spare you. Mabel looked at him. It might spare me from their voices. It would not spare me from mine. Mrs. Wilton stepped forward. There is a Mrs. Bexley in Lambeth who once served in a nursery at a house connected to Sussex. I cannot swear she is the same woman, but I can have the direction within the hour. Gideon looked to Mabel, not over her. Will you permit me to send a carriage and a footman at a distance? At a distance, she said, and a companion inside. The dowager's mouth curved. I shall lend you Mrs. Anstruther. She has outlived 2 husbands, 3 scandals, and a bishop's disapproval. No manservant from Redmarsh will frighten her. For the first time that day, Mabel nearly laughed. It came as a breath, small and startled, but it was hers. Gideon heard it. Something softened in his face and was gone. Outside, London continued arranging its whispers. Inside the library, the map to Sussex remained open, but Mabel turned away from it. She gathered the letter, the tin box, and the miniature. The Duke's glove remained on the table between them. No longer a shield she borrowed, but a promise he had not yet earned back. By afternoon, society would say she had been discarded. By evening, Redmarsh would believe fear had driven her into hiding. But by morning, with a widow companion at her side and the truth folded in her reticule, Mabel Lane would go looking for the first woman who might remember her name, Mrs. Anstruther arrived at Westmere House, wearing black bombazine, a bonnet with no ornament, and an expression that suggested she had buried every fool who ever underestimated her. Mabel liked her before the woman spoke. You are Miss Lane, Mrs. Anstruther said, looking her over with plain, unsentimental eyes. For the present, Mabel answered. That is a very sensible answer to an uncertain world. Come along then. If we are to call upon a frightened woman in Lambeth, we had better do so before fear has breakfasted. The carriage waiting. Outside was not the grand Westmere carriage that would have shouted a duke's involvement from every corner. It was modest, dark, and well-sprung, with a driver Mabel did not know, and a footman seated behind who wore no Westmere colours. Gideon had kept his word. Protection at a distance, not command, not concealment. Yet when Mabel stepped down from the front steps, she saw him across the street, speaking to a groom, as if chance had placed him there. He did not approach. He only looked once at her, then at the carriage, and inclined his head. Mabel understood the gesture. I am here. I will not crowd you. She entered the carriage with the tin box in her lap, the false letter folded in her reticule, and the miniature wrapped now in clean linen, because she had not taken back the Duke's glove. That mattered. It mattered more than she wished. London changed as they drove south. Mayfair's polished doors gave way to busier streets, narrower fronts, shop signs, carts, laundry lines, and the sharp smell of coal smoke. Mrs. Anstruther sat beside Mabel with a basket at her feet. Mrs. Wilton thought coal and tea might loosen memory better than noble pressure, she said. Mrs. Wilton is rarely wrong. And if Mrs. Bexley will not see me, Mabel asked, then we shall ask whether hunger, loneliness, or conscience is guarding the door, and address the correct jailer. Mabel looked out at the wet stones. She had imagined Mrs. Bexley for years without allowing herself to name the imagining. Sometimes the woman had been kind, sometimes guilty, sometimes a coward. Now she was an address, written on a slip of paper in Mrs. Wilton's tidy hand, and that made her almost more frightening. A memory could not shut a door, a living woman could. They found the lodging house off a narrow street where the air smelled of damp wool, soot, and cabbage water. The landlady eyed them with suspicion until Mrs. Anstruther gave her card and mentioned the Dowager Lady Westmere in a tone that made the title sound less like a social fact and more like a weather system. Within minutes, they were shown up a flight of worn stairs to a back room where an old woman sat near a small grate with almost no fire in it. She was thin, wrapped in a shawl mended at the edges, and her hands rested on her knees, as if she had trained them not to tremble. A younger woman stood behind her chair, pale and weary, with a tired child peering from her skirts. Mrs. Bexley looked at Mrs. Anstruther first, then at Mabel. The change in her face was so swift and terrible that Mabel reached for the doorframe. The old woman did not speak. She lifted one hand to her mouth and made a sound like a prayer broken in half. "It is you," she whispered. Mabel's heart struck once, painfully. "You know me." Mrs. Bexley began to weep without covering her face, not politely, not prettily. The tears moved through her as if they had waited 11 years for permission. "Oh, my lamb, my poor little lamb." Mabel could not move lamb. The word reached through fog, through corridors, through the smell of wet wool and a woman crying in a carriage. "My lamb, hush now. Not forever. Someone will remember." Mrs. Anstruther did not interrupt. She placed the basket on the table and took out tea, a loaf, a paper of sugar, and a small parcel of coal tokens. The younger woman stared as if Charity had arrived wearing boots too practical for sentiment. "Mrs. Bexley," Mabel said, and her voice did not sound like her own. "I need the truth. But first, is there anything you need before you can speak it?" The younger woman gave a bitter little laugh. "Coal would help. So would the apothecary being paid before he stops bringing laudanum drops for my boy's cough." Mrs. Bexley turned sharply. "Alice, don't beg." She did not beg, Mabel said. She looked at Mrs. Anstruther. Mrs. Anstruther opened her purse without hesitation. Lady Westmere expected Conscience to have expenses. Mabel paid the small bill from the money given for the errand, then set the coal tokens near the hearth. It was not a grand rescue. It did not change the room into comfort, but the younger woman's shoulders sank as if one stone had been removed from her back. Mrs. Bexley watched Mabel's hands. "You have her way," she said. "Your mother would give away her shawl and then pretend she had not noticed the cold." Mabel sat slowly on the chair opposite her. "My mother?" Mrs. Bexley nodded, tears shining. "Lady Elspeth Arundel, though she liked being called Elspeth by those who loved her, and no one else. Your father was Captain Rowan Arundel. You were Miss Mabel Arundel, from the day the vicar set your name in the parish book." The room tilted. Mabel gripped the tin box, because there had to be something solid in the world. Miss Mabel Arundel. The name did not feel like a crown. It felt like a door opening onto a house she had been too young to remember, but had mourned all the same. "Why was I brought to Redmarsh House?" Mrs. Bexley closed her eyes. "Because Lord Redmarsh said it was for the peace of the family. Because your parents died within months of one another." because there was confusion over trusteeships, and he said scandal would ruin what remained. He said you would be kept safe until matters were settled. Her voice broke. I was a nursery servant. I had no power against a baron and his papers. I believed him until I saw your name changed. Mabel took out the false letter and laid it on the table. This came yesterday, Mrs. Bexley recoiled before reading more than the first line. Those words. Who said them? Lord Redmarsh, in the carriage yard at Eastcombe. He told me that if I loved you, I would keep silent. For the peace of the family. Mabel felt cold spread through her fingers. Where is the proof? Mrs. Bexley looked toward her daughter, then toward the door. Fear entered the room again. He will know I spoke. Mrs. Anstruther rose and crossed to the window. She moved the curtain 1 inch. Her face hardened. A man in Redmarsh livery is very interested in the cobbler's window across the street. Mabel stood. Gideon had placed protection at a distance, and Redmarsh had placed fear at the door. For a moment the old instinct returned. Run, hide, give them nothing. Then Mrs. Bexley reached for her hand. Her fingers were dry, fragile, and desperate. Eastcombe Chapel, the old woman whispered. The prayer book in the vestry, brown leather. Your mother placed the marriage lines and a baptism copy there inside the back cover when she knew she was ill. She said paper in a solicitor's office could be mislaid by men, but a prayer book might be spared by God. Mabel bowed her head. She did not cry. The feeling was too large for tears. Will you say this again before witnesses? Mrs. Bexley looked toward the window, then back at Mabel. Shame and love struggled across her worn face. I should have done it years ago. Yes, I will say it. Downstairs, a door shut. Mrs. Anstruther snapped the curtain closed. We leave now. They did. The Redmarsh manservant had vanished by the time they reached the street, which meant he had gone to warn someone. Mabel knew it. Mrs. Anstruther knew it. Gideon knew it too, because his plain carriage appeared at the end of the lane before Mabel had taken 20 steps. This time he did approach, hat in hand, face grave. Mrs. Anstruther followed as expected. The girl kept her head. Mrs. Bexley has a memory and a conscience, though both are frightened. Gideon looked at Mabel. You found what you came for. I found my name. The words changed him, not visibly to anyone careless. But Mabel saw the breath he did not quite take. Miss Arundel, he said softly. It was the first time he spoke it. She nearly turned away. Do not make it beautiful yet, Your Grace. I do not know how to hold it. Then I will not, he paused. I owe you an apology, Mrs. Anstruther, with excellent judgment, pretended to inspect a shop sign. Gideon kept his voice low. Yesterday I mistook concealment for care. I thought if I removed you from danger, I had protected you. I failed to understand that being removed has been the danger all along. Mabel looked at him in the grey London light. I have not forgiven you entirely. I have not earned it entirely. That answer settled between them, plain and steady. No defense, no injured pride. It mattered, Mrs. Bexley says the marriage lines and baptism copy are in Eastcombe Chapel, Mabel said. Then we go to Eastcombe. Now, before Redmarsh does. The journey to Sussex blurred into wheels, road, and the growing weight of what waited. By late afternoon, Eastcombe Hall rose beyond bare trees, shuttered and solemn, with its chapel crouched beside it in weathered stone. Mabel stepped from the carriage before anyone could help her down. She did not know the place, yet the air seemed to know her. Gideon walked beside her, not ahead. At the chapel door, he stopped. The lock hung broken against the wood. The door stood open by an inch. Inside, the shadows waited, and with them the terrible knowledge that someone had reached her mother's last hiding place first. The chapel door opened with a sigh that sounded too much like surrender. Gideon stepped in first, because the darkness within was uneven. then stopped at once and turned slightly, leaving space for Mabel to enter of her own will. She understood that restraint now. He had learned the shape of her fear, and he no longer tried to cover it with command. The air inside Eastcombe Chapel was cold enough to make breath visible, though spring pressed softly against the fields outside. Dust lay on the pews. The narrow windows gave back a grey light. Near the vestry, mud had dried in broken prints across the stone floor, and the small cupboard beside the prayer desk stood open. Its lock had been forced. Mabel felt Mrs. Anstruther behind her, solid and silent. She wished suddenly for Mrs. Bexley, for the old woman's trembling voice, for any living proof that the words spoken in Lambeth had not been another cruel promise that arrived too late. Gideon crossed to the vestry cupboard and knelt. He did not touch at once. He looked first, taking in the splintered wood, the torn shelf lining, the blackened remains inside a shallow brass pan. "They burned something here," he said. Mabel moved toward him before Mrs. Anstruther could caution her. In the pan lay ash, curled scraps too fragile to read, and a corner of brown leather darkened by fire, a prayer book cover. She knew it before anyone named it. Her mother's last hiding place had become smoke. For one moment, Mabel heard nothing. Not the wind at the chapel door, not Gideon's quiet instruction to the footman waiting outside, not Mrs. Anstruther's sharp intake of breath. All she heard was the old lesson returning with merciless patience. Too late. You are always too late. She reached toward the ashes, but Gideon's hand moved near hers, not touching, only blocking the instinct. Careful. "If anything remains, we must preserve it." "Preserve?" Her voice sounded unfamiliar. "There is nothing left to preserve." "There may be. Do not turn ash into hope for my sake." He looked up at her. The words had struck him, but he did not retreat behind pride. "I won't." That small contraction, spoken in the cold ruin of the vestry, felt more human than any polished comfort could have done. Mabel stepped back and pressed both hands against the tin box. She had held herself steady through accusation, through the musicale, through the discovery of her name. But the sight of that burned. Leather reached the child in her, the child who had kept a portrait because no one would give her a document, the child who had believed, perhaps God had watched where men had not. "She hid it here," Mabel whispered. "Mrs. Bexley said my mother hid it here." "Then your mother expected danger," Gideon said. "And perhaps she expected more than one hiding place." Mabel shook her head. "You do not know that." "No. But I know she sent a portrait with you. She sent a ribbon. She sent a name through Mrs. Bexley. A woman careful enough to hide papers in a prayer book might not have trusted one prayer book entirely. Mrs. Anstruther, who had been examining the little table by the vestry wall, lifted something with the tip of her glove. "There is this." It was a pressed flower, browned flat with age, fallen between the boards and spared because it had slipped beneath the shelf. A tiny wax flake clung to it, pale blue marked with the faint impression of a bird. Gideon's expression sharpened. The Arundel crest. Mabel stared at the little ruin. A flower, a piece of wax. Not enough. Not enough to give a woman back her life. She looked down at the miniature in her reticule, wrapped now in linen. A memory stirred, fragile and sudden. Not words first, touch. Small fingers running over the back of the frame. A woman's hand guiding hers away. "Not there, my lamb. Not until need." Mabel stopped breathing. Gideon saw it. "What is it?" "The back." She drew out the miniature so quickly that Mrs. Anstruther stepped closer. The worn gilt frame trembled in Mabel's hands. "When I was little, I tried to open it. Someone stopped me. I thought it was because I might break the glass." Gideon came nearer slowly. "May I look?" She almost handed it to him by habit, then stopped. He noticed the pause and stepped back. "You may hold it, I can see from here." That was the moment trust changed shape. It did not become certainty. It became a door she could choose to open. "No," she said. "If there is something inside, I want it opened carefully. I do not know how." Gideon held out his hand, palm up, not demanding. "Then I will do it where you can see every movement." Mabel placed the portrait in his hand. The old fear clenched once and loosened only because his fingers closed with reverence. They moved to the narrow table beneath the window. Mrs. Anstruther held the candle. Gideon used a small penknife from his coat, not to pry crudely, but to lift the loosened backing where time had already raised the edge. Mabel watched the blade slide beneath old paper. Her whole life seemed to balance on that inch of motion. The backing lifted. A folded slip of paper, no larger than 2 fingers, lay hidden between frame and ivory. It had been stitched into place, with thread so fine it might have been hair. Gideon went still. There is something. Mabel gripped the table. "Read it. You should open it. My hands are not steady enough. Then we wait." She looked at him, startled. "For what? For your hands to become yours again." The chapel was silent. Mabel closed her eyes. She breathed once, then again. Her hands did not stop trembling entirely, but they returned to her. She took the folded paper and opened it. The ink was faded but legible, each word written in a fine, slanted hand. Mabel Arundel, baptized at Eastcombe Parish Chapel, daughter of Captain Rowan Arundel and Lady Elspeth Arundel. Recorded by Reverend Thomas Vale. If danger should fall upon her, Westmere will know the face. Mabel read it once, then again. The letters did not change. Her name remained. Not Lane, not girl. Not maid, Mabel Arundel. Beneath the written lines was a date, a smear of blue wax, and a second mark that looked like the edge of the same bird crest. Mrs. Anstruther sat down heavily in the nearest pew. "Well," she said, her voice rough. "There is a mother who knew how to fight after death." Mabel pressed the paper to her chest, careful not to crush it. She wanted to weep, but tears felt too small. Gideon did not congratulate her. He did not say it was over, because it was not. He looked toward the burned vestry, and understood what she did. If Redmarsh had reached the prayer book first, he knew they were close. He would not wait quietly for truth to gather witnesses. A horse sounded outside. The Westmere footman appeared in the chapel doorway, holding a folded note. "Your Grace." A rider brought this from London. Marked urgent. Gideon opened it. His face changed only slightly, but enough. "Lord Redmarsh has called a formal gathering at his house tomorrow afternoon," he said. "He intends to accuse you publicly of extortion, theft, and conspiracy against his family." Mrs. Anstruther gave a snort of disgust. How industrious villainy becomes when cornered. Mabel looked down at the hidden paper in her hand. Fear came, but it did not find the same woman it had ruled yesterday. "Then he means to bury me before I can speak." Gideon folded the note. "He means to frighten you out of speaking." "Will this be enough?" she asked. "The note, Mrs. Bexley, the crest, your memory of Eastcombe." "Enough to begin," he said. "Enough to make him dangerous." He turned fully toward her. "I will send calling cards, not to Redmarsh alone. To Lady Castledon, Sir Percival Dane, my solicitor, the retired vicar's nephew if he can be found, and every person whose silence Redmarsh hoped to use. If he wants a room, he shall have one. But not a room he controls." Mabel held his gaze. "And if they laugh before you finish, then I will stand beside you, not before me," his answer came quietly. "Beside you, not before you, unless you ask it." The words settled where fear had been, not removing it, giving her room around it. Mabel looked once more at the chapel, at the broken lock, the burned prayer book, the ash that had tried to become an ending. Then she folded her mother's hidden paper and placed it inside the tin box with the torn ribbon and the child's glove. "Send the cards," she said. "The truth has hidden long enough." By the time Westmere House opened its drawing room to receive witnesses, Mabel had learned that courage did not feel like flame. It felt like cold hands fastening buttons. It felt like standing before a mirror while Mrs. Wilton waited nearby with 3 possible gowns, and every one of them seemed to belong to someone else. The first was black, plain enough to remind the room that she had been a servant. The second was pale silk borrowed from the dowager's store, elegant enough to tempt society into believing she wished to be remade by rank. The third was grey wool, altered carefully to fit her, modest at the throat and sleeves, with no ornament except the torn blue ribbon Mabel had stitched herself into a narrow bow. She chose the grey. Not black, Mrs. Wilton asked, though her eyes suggested she already approved. No, Mabel said. I will not enter as Redmarsh made me, Mrs. Anstruther, seated by the fire with her reticule open like a weapon, looked over. And not silk, Mabel touched the ribbon. I will not enter as Westmere rescued me either, Mrs. Wilton's face softened by a fraction. Then you will enter as yourself. That was the trouble. Mabel did not yet know whether herself meant Lane or Arundel, maid or gentlewoman, hidden child or scandalous fraud. The folded paper from the miniature lay inside her reticule with the burned scrap, the child's glove, and both pieces of ribbon. The miniature itself rested against her palm. Its backing had been replaced with care, but she could still feel where the secret had slept for years, waiting for hands brave enough to disturb it. Downstairs, carriage wheels sounded one after another. Mayfair had come, not because Mayfair loved justice, but because it loved a crisis with titles attached. Lady Castledon arrived first, carrying authority like a scent. Sir Percival Dane followed, stiff with reluctance and curiosity. 2 older ladies who had been at the musical came together, whispering until the Westmere footman announced their names, then, falling silent, as if dignity had suddenly occurred to them. Gideon had arranged the room with the precision of a man who understood that power could hide in furniture. Chairs were placed so no one could claim a private corner. The dowager's seat faced the hearth. A small writing table stood near the window for Mr. Harcourt, the Westmere solicitor, who had arrived with papers tied in red tape and a face too serious for gossip. Mrs. Wilton and Mrs. Anstruther would remain in the room. No door would close on Mabel alone. No accusation would be allowed to become a whisper before it became a record. When Mabel came down, Gideon was waiting at the foot of the stairs. He wore dark morning dress, severe and exact, but there was nothing cold in the way he looked at her. He did not offer his arm at once. He let her reach the last step. You chose the grey, he said. Yes, it suits you. The words were simple. Because they were simple, they found a place to land. She looked past him toward the drawing room doors. Do you think they will see me? Some will see only what preserves their comfort. He paused. But they will hear you. If I can speak. You can. He did not say she must. That mattered. Mabel lifted her chin. Whatever happens in that room, Your Grace, I do not want revenge. His gaze held hers. What do you want? My name, my mother's truth. And the right not to be lied about. Gideon's expression changed, touched by something so restrained it almost passed for pain. Then that is what this room is for. She took one breath and entered. Conversation thinned as she crossed the threshold. She felt the familiar examination begin. Plain gown, no cap, no jewels. Too composed for a maid, too modest for an adventuress. Too much like the portrait for comfort. The dowager stood, which forced half the room to shift in respect. Miss Lane, she said clearly, will sit here. The chair was not at the edge. It was not hidden behind a table. It stood where anyone speaking to her would have to face her. Mabel sat. The act no longer shocked her as it had in Redmarsh House. It steadied her. Then the footman announced, Lord Redmarsh, Lady Redmarsh, and Miss Fenwick. The room seemed to inhale. Lord Redmarsh entered with a formal gravity polished for injury. Lady Redmarsh wore dark green and a veil fine enough to suggest distress, without obscuring expression. Cressida followed in blue again, but this time the colour looked less like innocence than challenge. Behind them came a narrow man with a leather case, introduced as Mr. Vale, solicitor to Lord Redmarsh. The name struck Mabel strangely, because it echoed Reverend Thomas Vale, the vicar named in her mother's hidden note. She held still. Lord Redmarsh bowed to the dowager with correct form, then to Gideon with less warmth. Your Grace, I had hoped you would reconsider lending your house to this unfortunate spectacle. Gideon answered without expression. You called for a public accusation. I have provided a room where public answers may survive. Lady Redmarsh looked toward Mabel, as if grief had forced her eyes there. Poor girl. I do wish she had accepted discretion. Discretion, the dowager said, so often means silence arranged by the guilty. A faint stir moved through the guests. Lord Redmarsh's solicitor opened his case. My client has suffered grave injury through slanderous implication. A servant formerly employed in his household has advanced claims based upon stolen property, theatrical resemblance, and the encouragement of persons whose motives may not be wholly disinterested. Gideon did not look at the man. He looked at Mabel. You may answer now or wait. Mabel's mouth was dry. Her heart beat so hard she felt it in the ribbon at her throat. I will answer what is mine to answer. She turned to the room. I was brought to Redmarsh House as a child. I was told gratitude should replace questions. I worked there for 11 years under the name Mabel Lane. I have not claimed rank because I desired it. I have asked who I was because others took care that I should not know. Cressida gave a little laugh. How beautifully practiced. Mabel looked at her. No. Practice belongs to people who are allowed to speak often. Silence followed. Lady Castleton's gaze sharpened. Sir Percival looked away. Lord Redmarsh stepped forward. Enough. This is vulgar performance. A maid has been flattered by attention until she mistakes herself for a heroine. The word maid moved through the room like a deliberate stain. Mabel felt it land, but it did not sink, not as it once had. Gideon's hand rested at his side, still and controlled. He did not interrupt. He had promised beside, not before, Mr. Harcourt, the Westmere solicitor, touched the papers before him, but did not yet open them. The last witness had not arrived. Mabel knew because Gideon had told her only that morning that a retired vicar's nephew had been located, but not whether he could reach London in time. The room waited on incomplete proof. Lord Redmarsh knew it. His smile returned. Let the maid recite her little inheritance tale, he said. When she is done, perhaps your Grace will permit those of us with family honour to repair what her ambition has damaged. Heat rose behind Mabel's eyes, but she did not bow her head. The miniature in her reticule pressed against her wrist like a pulse. Before Gideon could speak, the footman opened the door. A young clergyman stood there, travel-stained, breathless, and holding a wrapped parish book against his chest. Mr. Harcourt rose so swiftly his chair scraped the floor. Gideon's eyes moved to Mabel, and for the first time that day, the iron stillness in his face gave way to something like hope. The young clergyman crossed the threshold as if he had walked out of the past and into judgment. His coat was dusty from travel, his boots marked with road mud, and his hands held the wrapped parish book with the careful pressure of a man who understood that paper could wound the living and vindicate the dead. For one suspended moment, no one in the Westmere drawing-room spoke. Lord Redmarsh recovered first. This is absurd, he said. Am I to understand that strangers may burst into a private gathering and parade old church books before ladies? The clergyman bowed. breath still uneven. Reverend Samuel Vale, my lord. Nephew to the late Reverend Thomas Vale of Eastcombe Parish. I came at his Grace's request. The name Vale moved through the room like a key turning. Mabel felt her fingers close around the reticule in her lap. Reverend Thomas Vale. The name from her mother's hidden note. The name that had survived behind glass when a prayer book had burned. Mr. Harcourt stepped forward and took the parish book only after Reverend Vale released it formally. This book was removed from the Eastcombe parish chest before repairs to the chapel roof some years ago, the clergyman said. My uncle kept certain copied entries with his private papers, fearing damp and disorder at the estate. I did not understand the significance until his Grace's message arrived. Lord Redmarsh's face did not change enough for most people to call it fear. Mabel saw it. The small tightening beside his mouth, the cold glance toward Lady Redmarsh. Cressida's fingers curled into her skirt. Gideon remained beside Mabel's chair, not in front of it. His presence was a wall only where one was needed. His silence gave her room to breathe. Before that book is read, Lord Redmarsh said, I insist the girl state plainly what she claims. Let all present hear the scale of her ambition. Mabel rose. The grey wool of her dress brushed softly against the chair, and the blue ribbon at her throat seemed to weigh more than jewels. She looked first at the dowager, then at Gideon, then at the faces waiting to decide whether her pain had been persuasive enough. I claim that I was brought to Redmarsh House as a child and renamed Mabel Lane, she said. I claim that my mother was Lady Elspeth Arundel and my father Captain Rowan Arundel. I claim that I was made a servant in the house of the man who was meant to protect what remained of my family. Lady Redmarsh gave a low, wounded sound. This is monstrous. Yes, Mabel said quietly. It is. The answer stilled the room more than outrage would have done. Mr. Harcourt opened the parish book. Entry dated June 17, 1831. Mabel Elspeth Arundel, daughter of Captain Rowan Arundel, and Lady Elspeth Arundel, baptized at Eastcombe Parish Chapel. Witnessed by Reverend Thomas Vale, Mrs. Agnes Bexley, and Gideon Harrowby, Marquess of Keldham, by proxy through his father's household connection. A murmur rose. Sir Percival Dane leaned forward despite himself. Lady Castleton's eyes moved from the book to Mabel's face, and in them suspicion gave way to something sharper and less comfortable. Recognition. Lord Redmarsh laughed once. A parish entry proves birth. It proves nothing of theft, extortion, or the girl's conduct in my house. Gideon spoke then. No, your accounts will prove the rest, Mr. Harcourt untied a second packet. There are irregular withdrawals from the Arundel settlement. During the years, Miss Arundel was recorded in private correspondence as deceased abroad. The temporary trustee listed in those papers was Osric Fenwick, Baron Redmarsh. Lady Redmarsh rose halfway. Household clerks handled such matters. Servants carried messages. Old solicitors made mistakes. How useful servants become when blame is needed, the dowager said. Mrs. Wilton, standing near the wall, did not move, but several ladies looked toward her with new discomfort. Mabel lifted the miniature from her reticule. She had thought her hands would shake. They did not. My mother hid this note behind the portrait. She unfolded the paper and passed it to Mr. Harcourt. It gives my name, the baptism date, Reverend Vale's name, and the words, Westmere will know the face. Reverend Vale examined it and nodded. That is my uncle's hand in the notation beneath Lady Arundel's writing. He often added confirmation marks to family papers. Cressida's voice sliced through the room. A convenient scrap hidden in a frame after she had already searched the tin box. Silence fell. Mabel turned slowly toward her. I had not mentioned the tin box in this room. Cressida went white. Lady Redmarsh closed her eyes. Lord Redmarsh's head turned toward his daughter, with the first uncontrolled movement he had made all afternoon. The room understood at once. Not the whole crime, perhaps, but enough. Enough to know that Miss Fenwick had known of Mabel's hidden possessions before the public accusation. Enough to know the Redmarsh family had been searching, seizing, and fearing long before any servant could have invented a claim. Gideon's voice became very quiet. "How did you know of the tin box, Miss Fenwick?" Cressida's mouth opened. No practiced answer came. I heard servants mention it." Mrs. Wilton stepped forward one measured pace. "No servant of Westmere House spoke of it. At Redmarsh House, the box was found only after Miss Arundel requested to retrieve her property in the presence of witnesses." Lady Castleton looked at Lady Redmarsh. "That is unfortunate." The word carried the weight of a door closing. Lord Redmarsh moved toward the center of the room. "This has become a campaign against my family. A duke's influence, a frightened servant, an old woman's memory, and a damaged book. You will regret lending credit to it." He turned as if to leave. Gideon moved then, only one step. He did not touch him. He did not raise a hand. He simply placed himself between Lord Redmarsh and the door, with the calm authority of a man whose rank had never needed noise. "You may leave after Mr. Harcourt serves formal notice regarding the Arundel accounts, trusteeship, and restitution." Mr. Harcourt already had the paper in hand. Lord Redmarsh looked from the solicitor to the room, and for the first time his title did not save him from being seen. Sir Percival stood abruptly, face red. "I believe I have heard enough." Lady Castleton rose as well. "So have I." She turned to Mabel and inclined her head. It was not affection. It was acknowledgement, and in Mayfair, acknowledgement from a woman like Lady Castleton was a blade. Miss Arundel. The name crossed the room. Miss Arundel. Not Lane, not maid, not girl. Others followed because society often found courage after someone powerful made it fashionable. One lady whispered it. Another repeated it. Miss Arundel. Mabel did not smile. The moment was too solemn for triumph. Her mother had not suffered, so her daughter could enjoy watching enemies bleed socially. But justice had a sound, and for the first time in her life, it sounded like her own name spoken without contempt. Lady Redmarsh sank back into her chair. All manufactured grief drained from her face. Cressida stared at the floor. Lord Redmarsh received the solicitor's notice with stiff fingers. "This is not finished," he said. "No," Gideon answered. "It has only ceased being hidden. Invitations would be withdrawn before evening." Doors that had opened to Redmarsh money would close under the pressure of Westmere scrutiny and Lady Castleton's silence. Account books would be demanded. Mrs. Bexley's testimony would be secured. The easy lie that a maid had invented herself would not survive the night. One by one, the guests departed with the hushed urgency of people eager to carry truth while pretending not to gossip. At last, the room emptied until only Mabel, Gideon, the dowager Mrs. Wilton, and the fading afternoon light remained. Mabel stood where she had spoken, the miniature resting in her palm. She felt no sudden lightness. Restoration was not a bell rung once. It was a door unlocked after years of forgetting how to enter. Gideon came no closer than courtesy allowed. "Miss Arundel," he said, her eyes lifted to his. The name still felt new enough to hurt. "Now that I am no longer your portrait maid," she asked softly, "what do you see?" Gideon did not answer at once, and because he did not rush, Mabel believed he understood the danger of the question. A careless man would have said he saw a lady now. A sentimental man would have said he had always seen one. Gideon Harrowby looked at the miniature in her palm, at the blue ribbon against her grey dress, at the face she was still learning to own, and said, "I see a woman who survived being made small without becoming small." The words stayed with her long after the last carriage left Westmere House, long after Lord Redmarsh's name began. Passing through Mayfair with the sour taste of disgrace attached to it, long after Lady Castleton's silence removed more invitations than any public denunciation could have done. In the weeks that followed, justice did not arrive like a trumpet. It arrived in folded letters, in solicitors' appointments, in account books demanded and reluctantly surrendered in Mrs. Bexley giving her testimony, with Mrs. Anstruther seated beside her like a guardian crow. It arrived in Lady Redmarsh withdrawing to a relation's house in Bath, claiming nerves, though no one believed nerves had stolen a child's name. It arrived in Cressida, discovering that a blue gown could not save a reputation, once a room had seen the truth beneath it. It arrived in Lord Redmarsh losing trusteeship before he lost the last illusion that society would protect him, merely because he had once dined among it. Yet Mabel learned that being restored was not the same as being healed. Papers could call her Miss Mabel Arundel by noon, and leave her waking at midnight, still expecting Mrs. Pike's bell, Lady Redmarsh's correction, Cressida's laughter at the edge of a room. Freedom had rooms too large for a woman trained to occupy corners. Eastcombe Hall was larger than any room she had ever dared imagine belonging to her. When she first returned there properly, with Mrs. Wilton overseeing the opening of shutters, and the Dowager insisting that dust was not romance, but neglect, Mabel stood in the entrance hall for several minutes before crossing the threshold. The servants gathered at a respectful distance. Not Redmarsh servants. Eastcombe servants now, some newly hired, some returned from neighbouring houses after hearing the estate would live again. The oldest footman bowed and said, "Welcome home, Miss Arundel." Mabel had thought the words would lift her. Instead, they nearly brought her to her knees. Home was not a sound one learned in a day. It had to be repeated gently, until the heart stopped suspecting mockery. She spent the first week walking through the house with keys at her waist that felt too heavy and too symbolic, learning which windows stuck, which portraits needed cleaning, which tenants had waited years for repairs that Lord Redmarsh's accounts had delayed. She asked questions, she wrote answers. She listened more than she spoke. When a maid dropped a coal scuttle and froze in terror, Mabel bent to help gather the spilled pieces before the girl could apologize herself into tears. "A mistake is not a crime," Mabel said, and heard in her own voice the shape of a house becoming different from the one that had raised her. Gideon did not come for 7 days. He sent documents, updates from Mr. Harcourt, and one note written in his severe, clear hand. "Westmere assistance remains at your disposal, whether you wish for my presence or not." She read that line more often than she admitted. On the 8th day, his carriage arrived, with the Dowager's carriage behind it, because propriety travelled with love before love could be named. Mabel received them in the gallery, where dust sheets had been removed from the walls, and afternoon light fell across generations of Arundel faces. At the far end, newly cleaned, hung the full portrait of Lady Elspeth Arundel. The restoration had not made her mother less solemn, but it had returned depth to the grey eyes and blue to the ribbon at her shoulder. Beneath the portrait, on a small velvet stand, rested the miniature in its worn gilt frame. It no longer had to hide in an apron, a tin box, or the lining of fear. It belonged in the light. Gideon stopped several feet away when he saw it. The Dowager, after one look at both of them, announced that she wished to inspect the west windows and took Mrs. Wilton with her, leaving the gallery door open and the distance between Mabel and Gideon perfectly proper. For a moment, neither spoke. The house creaked softly around them, old wood adjusting to warmth after years of abandonment. Mabel looked at the portrait of her mother rather than at him. I thought finding her would answer everything. Gideon stood beside her, not too near. Did it answer anything? Yes. She touched the edge of the velvet stand. It answered enough. It told me I was not imagined. It did not tell me how to stop feeling like someone might take it all back. No one can take your name now. No. But fear is not always persuaded by documents. He accepted that with a slight bow of his head. Then I will not offer you documents as comfort. A small smile touched her mouth. That is wise. I am trying to become so. She looked at him then. The cold protector society feared was still there in the line of his shoulders, the discipline of his silence, the restraint that made every word chosen. But she had seen the man beneath it learn, apologize, wait, and stand beside her when standing before her would have been easier. You once asked what I saw, he said. You answered well, not fully. Her breath caught, though he had not moved. Gideon. It was the first time she had spoken his name without title. His expression changed with such quiet force that she felt the room alter. Mabel. Her name in his voice no longer sounded newly discovered. It sounded known. Westmere will continue to support the restitution of Eastcombe. Mr. Harcourt has instructions independent of any answer you give me. My mother will continue as your ally, Mrs. Wilton has already informed half my household that your comfort is a matter of state. None of that depends upon what I am about to ask. Mabel's fingers closed around the stand. Then ask it. He took one careful step closer, still leaving space enough for refusal to stand between them if she needed it. I love you. Not because you were hidden, and I found you. Not because you were wronged, and I could help set it right. I love the woman who kept a mother's face alive when the world told her memory was foolish. I love the woman who would not be protected by being erased. I love the woman who chose truth before safety and dignity before revenge. Mabel closed her eyes, not to avoid him but to let the words enter without the old house of fear rejecting them at the door. When she opened them, Lady Elspeth's portrait looked down in calm witness. I have a home now, Mabel said. Yes, a name. Yes, enough money to refuse you. His mouth softened. I have counted on that. A laugh escaped her, small and unguarded. It sounded strange in the gallery, like a bird startled into flight. Then I can choose you without needing rescue. Gideon's eyes held hers. That is the only answer I would trust. He did not take her hand until she offered it. When his fingers closed around hers, the touch was warm, steady, and public enough for honor through the open door, private enough for the heart. Then yes, she said. Not because you gave me back my life. Because when I began to take it back, you learned where to stand. The dowager's cane sounded somewhere beyond the hall, deliberately loud and approaching slowly enough to announce mercy. Mabel smiled through sudden tears. Gideon lifted her hand only enough to bow over it, formal as any drawing room and tender as any promise. Later, the servants would say, Miss Arundel looked different when she left the gallery, though none could agree how. She wore no jewels. Her dress was still grey. The old miniature still rested beneath Lady Elspeth's portrait in its worn frame. But the woman who passed through the doorway beside the Duke of Westmere no longer moved as if expecting to be called back, corrected, or erased. Behind her, the little portrait remained in the light. No longer evidence, no longer a secret, no longer the last proof of a stolen life. It was simply a mother's face returned to the house that remembered her, and beneath it, Mabel Arundel walked forward with her name, her home, and the man who had finally learned to love her without making love another cage.